Okay, the Committee on Science, Space, Technology will come to order. And I say to all of you, good morning and welcome to today's hearing entitled Climate Change, Examining the Processes Used to Create Science and Policy. In front of your packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth in testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome everyone here today for this hearing on climate change processes. When I became chairman of this committee, I stated that I wanted to bring up folks to testify on climate change science and policy because I believe there have been a lot of more questions than answers. The current administration has been moving full speed ahead with regulations and policy initiatives that it justifies based on the available science. Since these actions have the potential to severely damage our economy, there should be extra care in making sure that they're truly necessary and appropriate. Science is not perfect. It's a process of trial and error, and scientists are not infallible. They're just as human as any of us. As policymakers, we're tasked with making difficult decisions, sometimes when not all the answers are known. In cases such as these, we must rely upon the processes by which the information we do have is generated. And we must rely upon the fact that the people generating that information have adhered to these processes. The leaked emails from the University of East Anglia Climate Research Unit in the November of 2009 revealed that the scientists most vocal about the effects humans were having on the climate were not followed and were not following accepted scientific practices. Now, someone said that. That was said by someone. When these emails came to light, the administration proclaimed that the science generated by a corrupt process was still robust and still justified the policy measures it was taking. For many of us here, these emails were evidence that the trust in the underlying process was misplaced. I may not be a scientist, but as a politician, I can tell you when someone's trying to pull the wool over our eyes. This is an old saying, Caesar's wife must be beyond reproach. This is to say that even if there has been no evidence of wrongdoing, the supposition of wrongdoing is enough to undermine the trust in an entire enterprise. The legitimate quotations that have been raised about the processes used to generate climate change, science and policy have thus far been cast aside. The reluctance to engage in conversations with people who have doubts or question the veracity of climate science is at the heart of the wrongdoing that undermines trust in climate change science. In a hearing last November, I stated that reasonable people have serious questions about our knowledge of the state of the science, the evidence, and what constitutes a proportionate response. The hearing today will explore how basic and widely accepted scientific processes have been applied in building the foundation of climate science that we rely upon to make decisions. I look forward to returning the debate back to the methodical, deliberative, balanced, and transparent discussion that it ought to be. I thank the witnesses for being here, and I now recognize Ranking Member Johnson for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Chair now recognizes Ms. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, am I to assume that these witnesses are under oath today?
I didn't understand you.
Are the witnesses under oath today?
Yes. They are.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate you holding this hearing today. Political opinions on climate change vary greatly, and nowhere more than here in the U.S. Congress. As one who accepts the overwhelming scientific consensus around climate change, I welcome the opportunity for this committee to hear a number of perspectives on climate change. However, I believe this hearing will fall far short of providing a meaningful discourse on the subject. I am disappointed in the very broad scope of this hearing, which arguably ranges beyond the jurisdiction of this committee, without sufficient numbers of witnesses to do the topics justice. I believe that a subject as complex as we are attempting to cover today warrants, at the very least, multiple panels, if not multiple hearings, to hope to adequately cover everything from basic science to regulatory policy, and 1 2-hour hearing strikes me as too ambitious, if not a little negligent. Likewise, I'm disappointed by the makeup of the panel today. By that I mean no disrespect to these men or the quality of their work. However, for years, we Democrats have been accused of ignoring a large subset of climate science community that in varying degrees does not subscribe to the conclusions of the IPCC or otherwise does not accept the climate is changing, and that is largely due to human activity. We've been told that these scientists' voices have been squashed by a wide-ranging conspiracy, and that under the new House leadership, they would finally have a platform to dispel the alarmist mistruth about the science of global climate change. I look at this panel today and I must ask, well, where are they? Where are the masses of legitimate expert witnesses that will corroborate to the assertion that climate change is an unproven theory, or worse yet, a hoax? I don't see them today. Instead, the witnesses before the Science, Space, and Technology today include a business school professor of marketing and an economist and an energy industry lawyer. We also have 3 legitimate scientists, but it is worth noting that not one of them refutes the notion that the global climate is changing and that humans are a factor. The necessary oversight can be done right. For instance, in the last Congress, Energy and Environment Subcommittee Chairman Barrett sensed that time was running out in the waning days of the 111th Congress to have a balanced hearing on the subject, and held a 4-hour hearing with 3 panels covering 3 separate issues within climate change, and with a Republican witness on each panel. We can have reasonable discussions and disagree on the monetary costs of taking action and the devastating impacts of complacency. But science will not allow us to run from the facts, no matter how inconvenient these facts may be. To be fair, there is a danger in saying that science is settled and that our knowledge of climate change is conclusive. On the contrary, with the risk of this magnitude, the job of science will never be done. It will continue to evolve. We know that climate is changing and that we have our hand on the thermostat. But we must always keep looking for new answers, replacing opinions with data and projections and observations. We must continue to innovate in how we predict, measure, prevent, and adapt to climate change. That is the nature of science and of our stewardship of our planet. Congress should acknowledge that we are not experts and that allowing partisan politics to dictate the scientific understanding of climate change is cynical, short-sighted, and by definition, ignorant. I implore my colleagues to recognize the value of research and resist efforts to defund and destroy the very scientific community that will give us answers. We may not agree as to where the uncertainties within climate science lie, but we can all understand that vast and avoidable uncertainties will remain if we stop the progress of climate science. This may be the scientific and policy challenge of the millennium, and we have a responsibility to the nation and to the world to lead. The former ranking member, Republican member of Energy and Environment Subcommittee, Bob Inglis, eloquently conveyed his dismay at the recklessness of climate skepticism by comparing it to the diagnosis of a sick child. If 98 doctors prescribe one treatment and 2 doctors prescribe a different treatment, who are you going to follow? This committee has to decide between 2 choices when it comes to global climate change. We can allow the world's scientists to continue to conduct extensive research and improve our knowledge of this phenomenon, or we can just wait and watch it happen and hope for the best. Climate change is a cancer, and we don't cure cancer by refusing to test for it, calling the doctor a liar, and refusing to consider any treatment. We never stop looking for the cure. While I look forward to today's testimony and what will undoubtedly be a lively discussion, I must say that I sincerely hope that this committee is not beginning and ending its record on climate science in the 112th Congress with this hearing. We have so much more work to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, at this time I'd like to first, if there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And I want to introduce the witnesses that we don't consider anything but legitimate, and witnesses that haven't been here before because we've asked for them to be here before, and that has been turned down. So I just want to introduce first, our first witness is Dr. J. Scott Armstrong, Professor of Marketing at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Armstrong is an expert in forecasting and has literally written the book on the principles of forecasting. He's the founder of several and currently serves as editor more than half of a dozen peer-reviewed journals. Our second witness is Dr. Richard Muller, is a professor of physics at the University of California, Berkeley, and is a faculty senior scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. Dr. Muller is the author of over 100 peer-reviewed publications in views of particle physics, geophysics, applied physics, and astrophysics. He's currently chair of the Berkeley Earth Surface Temperature Project, which is attempting to create a new global surface temperature data set. Our third witness is Dr. John Christy, director of the Earth System Science Center and distinguished professor of atmospheric science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Dr. Christy is the Alabama State climatologist, where he has built his own climate data sets. Dr. Christy was a lead author in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change third assessment report in 2001 and a contributing author in 1992, 1994, 1995, and 2007. Our fourth witness is Mr. Peter Glaser, a partner with Troutman Saunders, LLP. He practices in the energy and environmental law fields and is the chair of the firm's climate change practice team. He specializes in environmental regulation and litigation, particularly in the area of air quality and global climate change. Our fifth witness is Dr. Kerry Emanuel, a professor of atmospheric science in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Emanuel's research interests focus on tropical meteorology and climate with a specialty in hurricane physics. He is the author or co-author of over 100 peer-reviewed publications and was elected to the National Academies of Science in 2007. Our final witness is Dr. David Montgomery, an independent economist and consultant and formerly the co-head of the Energy and Environmental Practice at Charles River Associates. Dr. Montgomery is an expert on economic issues associated with climate change policy, and he was the principal lead author of the second assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He was also Assistant Director of the U.S. Congressional Budget Office and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the U.S. Department of Energy. He also taught economics at the California Institute of Technology and at Stanford University. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes. Do your best to stay there. You're not held there, and if you need to go a little further, you need to cut it a little short. That's up to you. After which the members of the committee are going to have 5 minutes each. We will try to hold ourselves to that 5 minutes. You have leeway, of course, because we appreciate you being here. You've prepared yourself to come here. You're here, and we want to accord you everything that we can to get the benefit from your appearance here, and that the members of the committee get their chance to ask you questions about where you come from, how you got there, and what you have for us. So I recognize our first witness, Dr. J. Scott Armstrong, professor at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman Hall and Ranking Member Johnson. It's a pleasure to be here to testify. That's odd. Worked perfectly before we started here.
Is it not working now?
Not working. If everybody has a copy of it, I can just go through while you look on the copy.
got an expert looking over your shoulder right now.
Right. All right, here we go again. I'm back to 5 minutes, am I? No, it's not working.
And we haven't been started you yet. When I say go, you go.
Yeah, that's what we did. Well, that's conclusions. That's number one. Yeah, that's number one. That's why. That's your first one.
So I have to do it this way, just go on the side?
Because see, that's it. As
Yeah.
Go.
All right, thank you. Thanks for talking about my credentials. I started in 1968 when I graduated from MIT and specialized in forecasting methods. And it wound up recently, as you mentioned, with Principles of Forecasting, a handbook I did with 39 other experts around the world. So it's 50 years of experience so far. And we made it this if everybody can just get out the slides, I'll just go through from that. The slides aren't going to be as good because I had some fly-ins here, but the first thing is to start out with what we all agree with, and what we agree with is that climate changes. What we aren't sure about is what is the optimal temperature. In conclusion, the most appropriate evidence-based forecast is that there will be no long-term warming claim. Secondly, even if we have a scientific forecasting approach that supported global warming on a long-term basis, there's no logical basis for action. Now I'm going to tell you how I got there. To adopt policies related to global warming, you need three things. So the first is to forecast that there's a substantial, dangerous, long-term temperature change, absent with any regulations. Second is to show that this long-term change is going to cause harmful effects versus alternative policies such as doing nothing. Third is that you have cost-effective policies that will deal with any harmful effects. It's like a three-legged stool. So if any one of these legs is missing, then you have a problem. So the next slide, again, it would be much nicer if we could get this system working here. Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's not working, forget. The next slide shows the support that we have for these three elements of the leg. And I put them in that little box. We've been, it's an important problem. We've been searching. We're trying to find what evidence we have on each of those three legs identified. And that little box contains all of the scientific forecasts we've been able to find. It's an empty box. So the warming alarm is based on faulty forecasting method. The IPCC forecast uses judgments to develop a model. They then run the model. They make judgments on the outcomes. And basically, they're known as scenarios. The scenarios are not an appropriate method for forecasting. They have a role, but forecasting is not one of them. There are stories about the future, whether told in text or whether told by computer. We did an audit of the 2007 IPCC forecasting procedures using the principles from this book. There's 140 of them. We concluded that the IPCC violated 72 of the 89 relevant principles. Some of them were pretty serious, like using biased procedures to collect data. You should use unbiased procedures, and to be conservative when you have uncertainty. An example of the policy section, making policy based on global warming, we looked at the polar bear population forecasting. 2 government reports indicated there would be a sharp decline in the population of polar bears. Our forecasting audit revealed failure to use 87% of the relevant principles. They failed to provide, for example, full disclosure of the data, and long-term forecasts were used with only 5 years of data. They were able to make long-term forecasts. The global warming forecasts models have not been validated for predictive validity. We couldn't find any evidence on that, so we did it ourselves. We used the period from 1850 through 2007, and we found that we used a method called successive updating. We compared the error of our method, which is that there will be no change, with the IPCC forecast. And how large was the IPCC forecast? Well, on average, over the 10,750 forecasts that we checked, the IPCC forecast was 7.7 times larger. For the long-term forecast, 91 to 100 years, it was 12.6 times larger error than we have from assuming no change. So forecasting global warming lacks any scientific basis. Now, given that the critical legs of the stool cannot be supported, and that improper procedures have been used, in particular the lack of objectivity and the lack of full disclosure, we've concluded that this is basically an anti-scientific political movement. Has anything happened like this before? An anti-scientific political movement? So we started what we call the Analogies Project. There's been alarms. We're looking for alarms over serious things that are happening that might be averted at great cost. The analogy study, some of the alarms we got were things like DDT and cancer, eugenics movement, population growth and famine, starting with Malthus and then moving through computer models at MIT, and global warming, or the global cooling alarm. Government intervention was called for in 25 of the 26 analogous situations that we identified. They called for increased taxes, increased spending, and restrictions on individual liberties. Now, how accurate were these analogous forecasts? Well, of the 26 analogous situations, 19 of the forecasts were categorically wrong, 7 were wrong in degree, and we're yet to find an analogous situation where the forecasts were correct. Next thing we asked was, does government intervention help? There were 23 cases where they used government intervention, and harm was caused in 20 of those cases. And the policies were ineffective in 3 of the cases, and we found no cases in which the policies were effective. Summary of findings from the studies on alarming forecasts of dangerous man-made global warming are: the temperature forecasting procedures are improper, the policy forecasting procedures are improper, the forecast failed in a validation study, and none of the analogous alarms have been found to be correct. This thing about these alarming forecasts, it goes way back. It goes back to Macaulay in 1830. Julian Simon, my friend and colleague, in 1990 talked about all these alarms that the man-made is going to cause the end of the civilization, and he said he forecast in the early 90s that this global warming thing will blow over quickly. So that was one of his bad forecasts. The conclusion then is that the I have to get to this last slide. I don't have the latest slides. Thank you. The conclusions were, again, thank you. Nope, one more. Up one.
Let's move along with it. Now, you didn't have a fair opportunity because of the malfunction, and that's our fault. But we let you go well over. I hope you can conclude.
Okay, thanks. Recommendation number 1 is end government funding for climate change research. Recommendation number 2 is end government funding for research associated with global warming, things like alternative energy, CO2 reduction, habitat loss, things like that. Recommendation number 3, end government programs and repeal regulations predicated on global warming. Recommendation number 4, end global support for organizations that lobby or campaign predicated on global warming. Thank you for giving me the extra time, and this has been a challenge here.
Thank you, and I apologize for this scientific organization not to have the facility that you needed. Maybe we'll do better next time. At this time, I recognize Dr. Richard Muller, professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and a senior scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, to present your testimony. You have 5 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Hall and Ranking Member Johnson. In addition to those organizations, I'm the founder of the Berkeley Earth. Thank you, Chairman Hall and Ranking Member Johnson. In addition to those organizations, I'm the founder of the Berkeley Earth study, and my testimony today does not represent the views of those organizations, but are my personal views. I'll begin by talking about my view of global warming. Prior groups at NOAA, NASA, and the UK estimate about 1.2 degrees Celsius land temperature rise from the early 1900s to the present. That 1.2 degree rise is what we call global warming. Their work is excellent, and the Berkeley Earth Project strives to build on it. Human-caused global warming is somewhat smaller. According to the most recent IPCC report, the human component became apparent only after 1957 and amounts to most of the 0.7 degree rise since then. I'm not denying that there may have been human rise before that. Let's assume that by most, human-caused global warming is about 0.6. I'm not endorsing this number. I'm simply stating it as a working number. The magnitude of this rise is a key scientific and public policy concern. Just a 0.2 degree uncertainty puts the human component between 0.4 and 0.8 degrees. It's a factor of 2 uncertainty. This number needs to be improved, and Berkeley Earth is working to improve the accuracy of it by using a more complete set of data and looking at all biases in a new way. Let me talk about one of these potential biases, bias in data selection. The prior group selected for the analysis from 12 to 22% of the roughly 39,000 stations available. They believe their selection was unbiased. Outside groups have questioned that and claimed that the choice preferred records with large temperature increases. Such biases could be inadvertent, for example, as a result of choosing long, continuous records. This needs to be looked at carefully. To avoid station selection bias, Berkeley Earth has developed techniques to work with all available stations. In an initial test of our software and our analysis program, Berkeley Earth chose stations just randomly from the complete set. Such a selection of stations avoids station selection bias. In our preliminary analysis of these stations, we found a warming trend that's shown in the figure. Berkeley Earth is the black curve. The other 3 groups are in color. Our result is very similar to that reported by the prior groups, a rise of about 0.7 degrees Celsius since 1957. This agreement with the prior analysis surprised us, since our preliminary results don't yet address many of the known biases. When they do, it's possible that corrections could bring our current agreement into disagreement. Why such close agreement between our uncorrected data and their adjusted data? One possibility is that the systematic corrections applied by the other groups turn out to be small. We don't yet know. We will find out. Now let me address another issue, poor quality measurements. Many temperature stations in the United States are located near buildings, in parking lots, or close to heat sources. Anthony Watts and his team have shown that most of the current stations in the U.S. Historical Climatology Network would be ranked poor by NOAA's own standards, with error uncertainties up to 5 degrees Celsius. Did such poor station quality exaggerate the estimates of global warming? Berkeley Earth has studied this issue, and we have a preliminary answer, and the answer is no. Our analysis shows that over the past 50 years, the poor stations in the U.S. network do not show greater warming than do the good stations. Thus, although poor station quality might affect absolute temperature, does not, or variance in temperature, it doesn't appear to affect trends. And for global warming estimates, it's the trend that's important. Without the efforts of Anthony Watts and his team, we would have only a series of anecdotal images of poor temperature stations, and we would not be able to evaluate the integrity of the data. This is a case in which scientists receiving no government funding did crucial work to our understanding of climate change. Similarly for the work done by Steve McIntyre. Their, quote, amateur science is not amateur in quality. It is true science conducted with integrity and high standards. I was asked what legislation could advance our knowledge of climate change. After some consideration, I felt the creation of a Climate Advanced Research Project Agency, or Climate ARPA, could help. Government policy needs to encourage work such as that of Watts and McIntyre. Climate ARPA could be an organization that provides quick funding to worthwhile projects without regard to whether they support or challenge current understanding. In summary, despite potential biases in the data, methods of analysis can be used to reduce bias effects well enough to enable us to measure long-term Earth temperature changes. Data integrity is adequate. Based on our initial work at Berkeley Earth, I believe that some of the most worrisome biases are less of a problem than I had previously thought. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I want to say to Dr. Armstrong that your testimony will be in the record as you submitted it, as will all the testimony. And the malfunction won't cost you there. Who do we have next, Chris? Thank you, Dr. Muller. I now recognize Dr. Christy, Director of the Earth Systems Science Center at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Hall, Ranking Member Johnson, committee members, and my Congressman Brooks over here for this opportunity to be here. I'm here to address issues regarding the process by which major climate assessments have led to problems for you, our policymakers. I'm John Christy, Alabama State climatologist from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. My research deals specifically with climate science. I'm one of those few people who actually builds climate data sets from scratch to answer questions about climate variability and to test assertions people make about climate change. I was a lead author of the IPCC 2001 report and a secondary author of the others, which doesn't really mean much at all when you read my written testimony. Climate assessments like the IPCC use a process in which IPCC selected lead authors are given significant control over the text, including the authority to judge their own work against the work of their critics. You might call this a conflict of interest. This process has led to the propagation of incorrect and misleading information in the assessments, and thus should lead you to question the IPCC's general support for a catastrophic view of climate change. These reports do not represent the full range of scientific evidence on climate, and I have 3 examples. In the first case, I address the icon of the IPCC 2001, the hockey stick, and show that the hockey stick's author was the same IPCC lead author who, in my opinion, worked with a small group of cohorts and misrepresented the temperature record of the past 1,000 years by promoting his own result, neglecting studies that contradicted his, and allowing amputation of a disagreeable result and the splicing of unrelated data to hide the decline. Thus, in my view, conflicting data were eliminated or massaged, and real uncertainties were not acknowledged. In the second example from the recent IPCC 2007 report, evidence was presented by Dr. Ross McKittrick and others that indicated the popular surface temperature data sets were affected by warming not likely to be caused by greenhouse gases. This was raised serious doubts about using surface temperatures for evidence for greenhouse warming. The IPCC authors were themselves producers of these data sets, yet as final say authors, they sat in judgment over the controversy, eventually denying McKittrick's evidence with what turned out to be apparently their own fabricated claim. I discuss more about surface temperatures in my written testimony. In the third example, I demonstrate that in the EPA finding, which declared greenhouse gas as a dangerous threat, key evidence regarding the evaluation of climate models and their ability to depict the real atmosphere was misrepresented. In IPCC-like fashion, the EPA relied on establishment scientists, giving them authority to respond to evidence which contradicted the EPA finding with assertions that were not based on reliable data or methods. The evidence shows the EPA overstated the agreement between models and observations, when in fact there was significant disagreement. Finally, this issue has policy implications that may potentially raise the price of energy a lot, and thus essentially the price of everything else. As such, in my opinion, the U.S. Congress and EPA should not rely exclusively on the United Nations IPCC assessments and their sister assessments exclusively because the process by which they were written has been shown to produce biased, false, overconfident, and or misleading information about one of the most murky of sciences, climate. As I stated in my IAC testimony last year, climate science needs adult supervision. The Congress needs at least one second opinion, talking about medical ideas here, one second opinion, produced by expert climate scientists but overseen by a non-activist team, which includes those with experience in the scientific methods, such as physicists, in those who simply understand what's important for people, such as engineers, and in those who understand the legal aspects of admissible evidence and discovery, such as attorneys. I refer you to my written testimony submitted here from the Energy and Power hearing 3 weeks ago, where these points are fleshed out. Thank you for your consideration. I await your questions.
Thank you very much. And this is some of the testimony that's been withheld and the liberal press hadn't reported. I'm going to be watching how they report your testimony. I thank you very much, Sarge. At this time, I recognize Dr. Peter Glaser, a partner at Troutman Sanders, for 5 minutes to present his testimony. And I thank you, Dr. Christy, for staying within the 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Hall, Ranking Member Johnson, for the opportunity to appear today. My name is Peter Glaser. I'm not a doctor. I am a partner with the law firm of Troutman Sanders. Let me emphasize at the outset that I am not appearing before this subcommittee on behalf of any of my clients. The views I present here are my own and do not necessarily represent those of my clients, and I am not being compensated by them for this testimony. I have been asked to comment on the process EPA used to prepare its greenhouse gas endangerment finding, and that process suffered from a number of flaws, in my opinion, that undermine confidence in the substantive conclusions reached in that finding. These flaws are identified at more length in my written testimony, and I will provide a brief summary here. In the first place, EPA did not consider the societal health and welfare benefits created by the energy sources that produce greenhouse gas emissions. EPA's decision to limit its analysis in this fashion caused it to miss an obvious fact, and that is that over the last century, as anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have increased, and in EPA's view, the public health and welfare danger from these emissions has accelerated, every relevant indicator of public health and welfare has improved dramatically around the world rather than deteriorated. Moreover, EPA prejudged the principal issue on which the public was asked to comment when EPA proposed the endangerment finding, which was whether anthropogenic greenhouse gas emitted from new light-duty motor vehicles may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. Even before the comment period began, EPA had already made up its mind that it would issue the proposed finding. And indeed, the President had already agreed to the motor vehicle greenhouse gas regulations for which the endangerment finding was the necessary predicate. Other process flaws include the Administrator's failure to exercise independent judgment in determining the endangerment question. Instead, as the Administrator conceded, she relied almost exclusively on what she referred to as third-party assessment literature. In particular, on the critical question of whether anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are causing deleterious climate change, the Administrator relied most heavily on the work on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. The failure by her to exercise her own judgment is a violation, in my view, of the statutory provision under which the endangerment finding was made. The endangerment finding also violated various provisions of the Information Quality Act, or the IQA, and EPA's own IQA guidelines. For instance, EPA's IQA guidelines require to ensure the quality, integrity, and transparency of information on which EPA relies for major scientific reports. Despite relying so heavily on the IPCC, however, EPA never examined the quality, integrity, and transparency of the data and studies on which the IPCC itself relied. EPA decided instead that it could satisfy its IQA obligations as to the IPCC material by examining the IPCC's own information quality standards and procedures. EPA's rationale, however, does not pass muster on the IQA, but in any event, that rationale was undermined by the so-called ClimateGate revelations. ClimateGate showed that either EPA's investigation of the IPCC's procedures was wanting, or the IPCC had departed from those procedures. Either way, given the ClimateGate material, EPA should have at least afforded the public an opportunity to comment on whether EPA's reliance on the IPCC was justified in light of this new information, but EPA refused to do so. And the ClimateGate issue is discussed in more detail in a petition that is attached to my written testimony and is in the public record in the EPA docket. My testimony addresses a number of other process flaws and contrasts the abbreviated and expedited endangerment finding proceeding with the measured and methodical process that EPA uses to develop national ambient air quality standards, a process that, unlike the GHG endangerment finding process, involves numerous opportunities for public comment on successive draft scientific and policy assessments. I appreciate the opportunity to provide my testimony to you today, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Mr. Glaser, thank you very much. I recognize now Dr. Kerry A. Emanuel, professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Hall and Ranking Member Johnson, for this opportunity to speak to the integrity of the field of climate research. The basic physics of climate were established more than 100 years ago by distinguished scientists such as Jean-Baptiste Fourier, John Tyndall. In particular, they established that our planet is habitable thanks to gases that comprise less than 3% of our atmosphere. Already in 1897, the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius projected that fossil fuel combustion would increase carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and estimated by hand that doubling CO2 would increase surface temperatures by between 5 and 6 degrees centigrade. Analysis of paleoclimate records suggests that natural climate change is caused by variations in solar output, the Earth's orbit around the sun, aerosols, and in greenhouse gases. In particular, elevated greenhouse gases are the primary suspect in explaining the very warm climates of some of the Earth's past. The scientific basis for the existence of significant risks from anthropogenic climate change is solid and rests on the principles of physics established more than a century ago, as well as on records of the Earth's climate as recorded by instruments and in the geological record. The conclusions of the scientific community that warming of the climate system is unequivocal and that most of the observed increase in global temperature since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in greenhouse gas rests on sound scientific research. I need not review for you the fact that virtually every major scientific organization that deals with climate around the world has issued strong statements warning of the risks of climate change. Many government agencies and private enterprises are taking the risks of climate change quite seriously. For example, our own Defense Department has recently issued a report expressing concern about political instability arising from water and food shortages in several locations around the globe. Historically, science, including climate sciences, have tended to be conservative and to underestimate risk. I could give you many examples, but a recent and tragic example is the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, caused by a magnitude 9 earthquake. The best projections before the earthquake of the largest earthquake that region should experience was 8.3, many, many times lower than what was observed. Notwithstanding anything I've just told you, there is universal agreement among scientists that current assessments of the risk of climate change are highly uncertain. In my view, it is unlikely that these uncertainties will decline appreciably over the next decade. Because of this uncertainty, there is no scientific basis for the confidence expressed by some that the effects of climate change will be benign. In respect to the stolen emails, and I know something about that, Mr. Chairman, because I served on the scientific advisory panel put together by the Royal Society in England to investigate such allegations, while there's general agreement that the preparation of a particular graph by a few scientists shows poor judgment in omitting a part of the record that was demonstrably false, there is no evidence for an intent to deceive. Efforts by some to leverage this into a sweeping condemnation of a whole scholarly endeavor should be seen for what they are. Now, all scientific endeavors entail some diversity of views, including mavericks who challenge accepted science. There are biomedical researchers who do not think that HIV causes AIDS. Though surprisingly recently, there were geologists who thought that the theory of plate tectonics is incorrect. While usually wrong, such mavericks are indispensable to the progress of science, forcing others to constantly test their assumptions, evidence, and results. But politicians who make mascots out of mavericks are invariably engaging in advocacy. They are fond of saying that science is not done by consensus. This is true, but if policy is not formulated on the basis of a sound scientific consensus, then it is almost certainly based on political considerations. Dealing with risks entailed in climate change will be extraordinarily difficult, and reasonable people will differ on questions of strategy. But citizens expect their representatives to confront this issue in an open and honest way. Making mascots of scientific mavericks or shooting the messengers are not rational options. Nations that are first off the mark in developing new technologies and policies that address the risks, selling those technologies to rapidly developing countries will prosper. Now, let me finish by speaking to you more as a citizen than as a scientist. We properly revere our forefathers for making material and mortal sacrifices for our benefit. One only hopes that our descendants will hold us in similar regard. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. David Montgomery, an economist, PhD from Harvard, for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Hall and Ranking Member Johnson, for this opportunity to testify before the committee. I am not here to question climate science. I'm an economist, and instead what I intend to discuss are failures in economic analysis that I believe have led scientists and others to reach entirely unjustifiable conclusions about public policy. The economics of climate policy are in fact shaped by several generally accepted propositions from mainstream climate science. It is a global phenomenon driven by global emissions, so that it does not matter where the emissions came from. Concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are what matter, not emissions in a single year, and these concentrations change very slowly. And stabilizing global temperatures at any level ultimately requires reducing net greenhouse gas emissions to zero. These propositions lead to some important economic principles. To avoid unnecessary economic harm, policy must involve comparable efforts by all countries. Mandates for emission reductions must not get out ahead of technology readiness, and effective R&D policy is essential. Now, reducing greenhouse gas emissions will have a cost. All the comprehensive economic models used to study past proposals before this Congress have agreed on this point. Model results differ about the size of these costs, but the differences stem from the model's varied assumptions, particularly those about future technology and about the nature of the policies that are assumed to be employed. All the models find that the deeper the emission cuts are, the higher is the cost of making them. Moreover, these costs are not just waiting a few months for GDP to catch up, as EPA officials are fond of saying. There are losses every year relative to the standard of living that would otherwise be achieved, and those costs grow over time. We keep hearing that we need emission regulations to create jobs and new industries. The green jobs claims are simply wrong and come from studies that only tell half the story. They add up jobs in producing green energy and ignore what happens to all the rest of the economy that would face higher energy costs and an eroded competitive position. This is so obvious to economists that few have even bothered to comment. Nor will climate regulations enable a U.S. clean energy industry to compete more effectively in global markets. Regulations may create a demand for low-carbon energy, but the evidence is clear that industries producing that equipment are increasingly being located in countries that do not bear the cost of reducing their own emissions. There are a number of additional ways in which the costs of policies intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions have been underestimated in recent studies, and their benefits exaggerated. 2 points are very important. Many studies that use current policy baselines ignore the costs of greenhouse gas policies that were put in place by past legislation, like the Energy Security Act and the stimulus package, when they look at the costs of, say, a proposal for cap-and-trade regulations. It's like celebrating how much cheaper a home improvement project has become because you paid half the bill in advance. You have to look at the whole thing, unfortunately. And many of these studies do not model the actual policies being proposed and instead estimate the much lower costs of idealized optimal policies. And you are going to face a very large problem when you hear about estimates of the cost of EPA regulations, because there is no economic model that can really capture all the distortions that they are going to create in the economy. And they will probably assume something much more efficient in coming to you with cost estimates. Now, there are other practices that underestimate costs, such as widespread use of what many of my colleagues and I call free lunch assumptions that I cover in my written testimony. If fears about climate change are correct, curbs on greenhouse gas emissions will have some benefit. But the harm to the United States that can be avoided directly by our action is often greatly exaggerated. I discussed the topic of avoided damages from climate regulations and how they've been distorted in my written testimony. Right now, I'd like to just make one point, that efforts to reduce our own emissions would make almost no direct difference to global temperature, especially if industrial production and associated emissions are simply exported to other countries. The Environmental Protection Agency's own modeling of climate impacts of the Lieberman-Warner Bill, using a model developed at Pacific Northwest Laboratories in the University of Maryland called MINICAM, shows that the Lieberman-Warner Bill, which would have had massively expensive economy-wide effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, would only reduce global concentrations of greenhouse gases by 12 parts per million. And that's against a target of 550 parts per million. By itself, the U.S. can't make a difference, and therefore there will be no benefits to the U.S. of unilateral action. And there is no sign that China, India, and other rapidly industrializing countries will take actions that would undermine their economic interests. Unless we find a more effective approach to international action that brings them along, U.S. emission reductions are likely to have costs far greater than their benefits. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Johnson.
I've had a malfunction here. My seat's gone. I don't know who punched on. Eddie, you didn't do this to me, did you? Can I get the damn thing up?
Yeah. Do you see it? Yeah.
Better turn this off before I call it what it is. I know Eddie wouldn't do that to me. That probably came from some of my own folks here. I thank all of you for your testimony, and I once again remind our committee and the members that ask you to limit your question into 5 minutes. I'll open with some questions, and I thank all of you for your good testimony. This is a group that I've wanted from the beginning, and we've asked for it in letters from the opposite side and been turned down. And this isn't, and the ranking member said, I think in her closing statements, that hope this is not the beginning and the ending of the record on climate science in the 112th Congress with this hearing. It won't be. We're going to have others, because we want to finally get to those who did indicate that it was, as you have, that it was bad science, and some had the right to question that science, and to find out those that will question. We'll have that committee at a later time here. Let me start my Dr. Peter. I don't want to call you a doctor if you're not a doctor. Mr. Glaser, is that right? In your testimony, you discussed the timeline of the issuance of the endangerment finding, and I appreciate you bringing that up. With respect to the promulgation of standards for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from motor vehicles worked out with the White House, automakers, California state regulators, and environmental groups. You state that the timing of the auto rules suggests that the endangerment finding was predetermined. Do you want to enlarge on that a little bit? Now, how often does EPA change the direction of its rulemaking between the issuance of the proposed rule and the release of the final rule?
Yeah, I can address that. It happens. And in fact, it has happened very, very recently. One good example of EPA substantially changing a regulation in response to public comments is the so-called Boiler MACT rule, which is a rule to address hazardous air pollutant emissions from commercial and industrial boilers. In that case, EPA made a proposal. They got very, very significant comments in opposition, and in the final rule that was just issued, EPA made extremely or very significant changes to the rule, and they say they are going to consider further changes still. So the integrity of the public comment period is very important. The process changes or the process flaws that I talk about in my testimony are not technicalities. They are meant to protect the integrity of the ultimate decision that is reached. So when we have a situation as we had here, when the administration came to office determined to regulate greenhouse gases through the Clean Air Act if necessary, and therefore pretty early in the administration committed to the motor vehicle regulations for which the endangerment finding was the necessary predicate, it undermines the integrity of the process. It undermines the ability of the public to affect that process with comments, and therefore undermines the integrity of the ultimate decision reached.
Thank you, sir. How does that predetermination of the final rule affect the usefulness and the legitimacy of the rulemaking process?
Yeah, well, as I said,
you touched on that, but I have a couple of minutes left. I hope you'll give us an answer on that.
Yeah, sure. The whole purpose that we have notice and comment rulemaking, which EPA undertook for the endangerment finding, is for the public to come in and to be able to present information and studies and affect what the ultimate decision would be. Keep in mind that the fundamental question that EPA was asking when it put the endangerment finding out for public comment was, should we be making this endangerment finding? Do we have a basis for making this endangerment finding? There were lots of comments that were submitted saying, no, you should not do that, but it did not appear to me anyway, and to many others, that that was an outcome that was possible. In other words, that EPA would change its mind and not make an endangerment finding. One way we know this is that EPA only allowed a 60-day comment period for the endangerment finding, 60 days to comment on this massive scientific or massive amount of scientific information. It wasn't enough time. But in my view, EPA had determined that it wanted to move very quickly on the underlying regulations, which drove the endangerment finding process forward more quickly than it should have been, and therefore really made it difficult for companies, members of the public, private institutions, public institutions to make comments and ultimately to affect the process.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Montgomery, if the United States were to drastically reduce carbon dioxide emissions, electric utilities would have to rapidly retire traditional and coal-fired power plants, which currently make up approximately 45% of America's current generation mix. And the EIA anticipates, that's the Energy Information Administration, anticipates that coal will remain an important part of our electricity generation, producing 43% of our total generation by the year 2035. So considering the EIA projects that they project electricity demand will increase in the United States by 21% by 2035, what would be the repercussion from removing coal, say, from the generation mix?
Mr. Chairman, removing coal from the generation mix would impose very large costs and potentially disruptive effects on electricity markets. It all depends on how fast it's done and the extent to which technologies such as carbon capture and sequestration become available and make it possible actually to continue to use coal through clean coal technologies which capture carbon and sequester it. But all of those technologies are unproven in the future, at best in an experimental stage, and are themselves subject to a number of regulatory and environmental objections. We looked just at the retirements that, and when I was at Charles River Associates, we looked just at the retirements that would be associated with EPA's greenhouse gas regulations, and concluded that they would produce very large increases in electricity costs, maybe something like, I'm relying on memory now, a 40 to 50% increase in wholesale electricity prices over the next 10 years or so, and quite large impacts on the standard of living. I remember something on the order of $500 to $1,000, say, loss in income to the average worker.
Okay, I thank you. Recognizing that China, Russia, Mexico, India, and on are not going to participate with us financially, and that's a fact, is it not? Yes or no? Yes.
Yes, it is. We see very little evidence that China and India
does
will
it
go along.
surprise you that we spent over $30 billion just on research with no expectation of any money from them? So somebody's got to go by the cash register, haven't they? You're an economist. There's a cash register in every store in this town, and there'll be a cash register involved here, and I think they ought to consider that. I think that's your opinion, isn't it?
Yes, it is. There will
Thank
be
you,
cost
sir.
to what we do.
I yield back my time. This time I recognize Mrs. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to pose this question to the three physical scientists on the panel, Dr. Christy, Dr. Muller, and Dr. Emanuel. There seems to be some attitude that there is an elaborate hoax orchestrated by the scientific community on global change. And I don't know that I've heard you argue whether or not there is global change happening and human activity is a factor. Instead, it's more of a disagreement over the magnitude of warming and the degree of which human activity plays a role. Based on your work, the three of you, do you agree that the global temperatures are rising and will continue to rise, and that greenhouse gas concentrations are at least partly to blame?
The global temperature might continue to rise, it might not, but greenhouse gases, the extra greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere, are indeed a warming influence. The big question is, what are the other gazillion things that affect global temperature going to do as a result? But greenhouse gases in and of themselves do exert a warming influence on the planet.
Thank you.
I agree with Dr. Christy. Greenhouse gases do exert a warming. I believe we are seeing that warming. The issue in my mind is not whether we're seeing it, but what is the degree. Is it something which, if it's at the high end, we really do need to move very rapidly, although we do have to engage the other countries because, as Dr. Montgomery said, most of the warming is not going to come from the United States. Most of the carbon dioxide will come from other countries in the world. On the other hand, if the warming is a little bit less, the models have the ability to account for less. There are unknowns in the models having to do with cloud cover feedback and water vapor feedback. And so if the warming is a little bit less than we thought previously, then we have time to implement some more long-term solutions that currently some people object to because they wouldn't work within the next short period of time.
I think all three of us are in pretty good agreement on this point. The planet is warming up. The bulk of evidence suggests that increasing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have something to do with it. And we're all in agreement that, unfortunately, when we try to project forward, the risks are poorly quantified at this point. And projections that have been made by modelers range from the benign to the catastrophic. So the problem for all of us is, how do we deal with the risk that is so uncertainly quantified?
Do you think we have the answers now, or do we we need to continue to do the research?
I believe that continued research is essential and should be expanded. There has been, you asked about a conspiracy earlier. I don't believe there's a conspiracy, but I do believe that many of the scientists who have been involved in this field are so deeply concerned about what they found that they work as advocates. And when they work as advocates, there's a danger that they lose their impartiality. And I fear that this is happening. I fear that the scientists are not trusting the public enough. They feel they have to make it clear how scared they are, and then they're advocates and no longer scientists. And the bad effect of this is that the public then loses some of its trust in science, and that is deeply unfortunate. In Berkeley Earth, our goal is to not have any political views, not to become advocates, simply do the best job we can on the science.
Thank you.
You're asking a scientist if he wants more research? I'll leave that answer there. But I would say this. One of the things I do is I test climate model output that's been talked about here. And what we found is that the climate model output does not match up to the real world. So I would say we have many questions out there that do need to be addressed. And so that's a foundation for more research, yes.
I would just chime in here that there are regions of disagreement between observations and models. And some of those disagreements have showed demonstrably that the model projections have been too conservative. So once again, I emphasize that anyone who pretends to a certainty in a benign outcome is probably kidding himself. Now, I think, of course, it's ridiculous that there was ever a notion that thousands of scientists all over the world would be engaged in some kind of hoax. It seems to me a hoax itself that kind of statement ever got made. I don't understand that. I want to say one thing about the IPCC because I sense a widespread misperception, probably not among the panel, but perhaps among the members. It is not a research organization. It does not conduct research. It doesn't fund research. It was set up usually in response to requests from broad segments of the public as a communications exercise between scientists and the public. One can certainly claim that it hasn't been perfect in this regard, but that's what it is. And so when people say you shouldn't trust IPCC research, they're not actually speaking about that body correctly.
Thank you very much. My time has expired, but I think we can finally say that global warming is happening. The details of it and the various ranges of concern and opinion will rest with continual research.
Chair at this time recognizes Mr. Sensenbrenner, Vice Chairman of this committee. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to have a few questions for Dr. Emanuel, but as a predicate, let me say that I think that the scientific community has wrapped itself too tightly around the axle-rod of the fatally flawed Kyoto Protocol, which led 134 countries off the hook. And we're seeing, huge increases in emissions from countries like China and India. And as a result, with draconian increases in the cost of energy, this is no longer an environmental debate, but it's a debate on jobs and economics and who wins and who loses in jobs and economics. Now, Dr. Emanuel, on December 10th of 2009, which was a couple of weeks after the release of the emails, you were at a forum at MIT, which you kind of had a very advocacy comments on that. And about 3 months afterwards, you were appointed to the Oxborough panel, which was supposed to look into the circumstances around the emails and the release of the emails from the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia. And I question the objectivity of that panel, but since you were a member of it, I want to ask you 5 questions ad seriatim, and if the answer is yes to any of them, please let us know. If the answer is no to all of them, let us know. First question is, does the panel have any written terms of reference, and if so, what were those terms? Did the panel issue a call for reference? Did they hold any public hearings? Did the panel interview any of the critics of the Climate Research Unit's scientific work? And were the panel interviews with CRU staff recorded and released? Now, are any of those questions to be answered yes?
I must confess I couldn't write them down.
Okay.
All right.
Would you like me to repeat?
But let me say, because I was on the panel, we did have clear terms of reference. That much I can tell you. We did write a report whose release was public, And let me say that the scope of that panel was very narrowly defined. As you are, I'm sure, aware, there were several panels that did
Okay,
investigation.
if I may interrupt you,
Yeah.
the question that I asked was not whether the report was released, but were any of the panel interviews with CRU staff recorded and released?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to simply say that our objective, we were told, was to determine whether there had been any sort of breach of scientific integrity in this particular unit, CRU. It wasn't a comprehensive review of the quality of the science, anything like that. It was a very narrowly defined objective.
Okay, well, this has called into question the quality of the science and whether the scientific community put the wagons in a rather tight circle. I have a press release from the British Parliament, and there's a Labour Party MP named Graham Stringer who has said, Oxborough didn't go as far as I expected. The Oxborough report looks more like a whitewash. And then I go back to the fact that Lord Oxborough is the vice chairman of an environmental group called Globe International, the CEO of Carbon Capture and Storage, and chairman of Falk Renewable Enterprise. All of them are advocacy groups. All of them, or two of them, have the potential of making a lot of money if all of this is implemented. And isn't that a conflict of interest?
All I can say in response to that is that as part of this commission, which involves some very gifted scientists who have no axe to grind at all in this climate debate, the papers we read, the interviews we conducted, showed that the entire enterprise was one of great integrity.
Well, that's not what the Labour Party MP says, Mr. Stringer, and he is a member of the Select Committee on Science and Technology and has a PhD in chemistry. He said it was a whitewash, and here the chairman of this group ends up, I think, having a very clear conflict of interest. You know, I can tell you that if the President or the Congress appointed somebody with those types of conflicts to head an investigation over something that has cropped up, I think that that chairman would end up getting drummed out of office, and because of the conflict of interest. And you know, I don't know how we can believe the report of the commission that you were on, simply because there was no real sunshine in on the process. There wasn't any public hearings. They didn't interview any critics of their scientific work, and the interviews with the CR staff were neither recorded nor released. Now, you know, we're just saying that you who have been an advocate, witness your comments at MIT, should state that the commission that you were on is objective. And I don't think anybody who wants to be fair-minded of this can buy it. My time is up, and I yield it back.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Muller, the gentleman from North Carolina, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by moving into the record a paper that comes from Professor Armstrong's website on predicting elections from politicians' faces. It concludes that surveys of voters taken a year out before an election are predictive of how elections will come out based upon voters' snap judgments of the competency of the politicians' faces. It appears to forecast that Hillary Clinton will run away with the 2008 presidential nomination, and that the Republican nomination will be a dead heat between John McCain and Duncan Hunter. I would now move this into the record.
Let me ask, has my staff had an opportunity to review it? Staff hadn't had an opportunity to review it, so I reserve the right to object to the inclusion.
All right.
Would the gentleman
I really don't
question
have any,
at this point
I don't have
about
time.
the relevancy of what you have just put into the record?
It's not in the record.
What's on? Thank you.
All right. Mr. Glaser, your testimony is the most peculiar testimony I've ever heard before a congressional committee. if you went to the Players Retreat, a bar in Raleigh, you could find tonight, you could find a set of lawyers who are sharing a pitch or two and complaining about the rulings the judges made against him the previous week, and they'd say, he didn't even listen, he had his mind made up, and on and on. But I've never really heard testimony by a lawyer before a congressional committee to that effect. Now, you take some pains to say, both in your written testimony and in your oral testimony, that you are offering your own personal opinions in your testimony here. But you're offering your personal opinions about the very same matters about which you've appeared as an attorney. Now, it is unethical for a lawyer to offer their own personal opinions in any matter in which they represent a client. Isn't that correct? I've heard judges admonish lawyers from the bench when they say, "Your Honor, I think." The judge will say, "Counsel, you are not here to tell me what you think. You are here to tell me your client's position." That's correct, right?
Not in front of this body, sir.
No, I didn't say in front of this body, but in front of this body, you were saying now, these are your personal opinions. I don't think many clients would really like their attorney going out and saying, "Here's how I disagree with my client." Is there any point on which you disagree with your client?
In what respect, sir?
Well, I mean, any respect. I mean, you've offered as witness as your testimony today what is clearly a lightly edited version of a brief you wrote on behalf of your clients. But while you're saying to a court or to the EPA in a rulemaking matter that that's your client's opinion, you are now saying it's also your personal opinion. So is there any way in which your personal opinion that you offer here today differs from the opinions of your clients on facts or on law? The answer to that is no, isn't it?
Wait. You know what? I don't know the answer to that question because I have not reviewed the testimony in detail with all of my clients. I can tell you I hope they don't.
Well, you have submitted to this committee filings that you have made with the EPA and with the court.
Yeah, I did.
As part of your testimony to us.
I did submit an attachment that I felt would be valuable. Now, that, of course, is a public document that was filed, and so I did submit it. The committee, of course, is free to review the record and see what else they want to take a look at.
Don't interrupt the witness. Let him repeat and answer your question, please.
No, Mr. Chairman, I've never heard that the rule. I mean, the rule has been that it's my time and that I get to control my time. And if a witness is filibustering, I can cut them off so I can get answers.
All I'm asking you to do is be fair with these people who are given a lot of time.
I'll try to be fair. I'll try to be polite. But I will.
Just be fair with them is all I ask of you. That's not asking too much, is it?
No. So,
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we give our colleague an extra minute because
I'll give him an extra 5 minutes because he's just getting in more and more trouble all the time.
So, Mr. Glaser, you have not convinced the EPA of the correctness of your position. You have not yet convinced the court of the correctness of your client's position, but you have convinced yourself of the correctness of your position.
Yes, and we will be bringing this to the court. I have been asked here to come here and testify about the process under which the endangerment finding was prepared. I have done so, sir.
All right, and how much have you or your law firm been paid by your clients before for appearing on their behalf before the EPA? And in litigation?
Sir, I cannot disclose confidential communications between myself and my client.
Including how much they paid you?
Absolutely. I hope that you can appreciate that I cannot breach attorney-client privilege.
You have said that you've told this committee that the EPA, obviously we should think poorly of the EPA. They really didn't listen to your arguments. They didn't follow the law. They violated the law, on and on. If the court doesn't hold for you, if the court also disagrees with you, what should we think of the court?
I think that you should first of all wait and see what the court says, number one, but number two, I am offering my opinions here both on law and on proper administrative policy. You could say, for instance, is it a violation of law for EPA to have only allowed a 60-day comment period? Well, you could differ on that. Court might say, okay, 60 days, that's enough. Is that good policy? Is that good administrative policy? My recommendation would be no, that's not good administrative policy.
Okay. I mean, you seem to, or it is odd that you were asked to testify with respect to a matter pending before the courts and to give basically a legal argument, the same legal argument that you made before the courts. But one obvious difference between appearing before this committee and appearing before the court is before a court, there will be more than one argument. There will be another lawyer there representing the other point of view. Isn't that right?
Certainly before the court, there will be multiple points of view expressed. You do have to understand that the cases that you're talking about in court have been challenged, EPA's regulations have been challenged by a very large segment of the business community. There are states' pros and cons. There's EPA on one side. There are interveners. The court will definitely hear a variety of arguments. I can't dispute that.
Right. And another important distinction is before court, you will be appearing before a neutral judge with no interest, not before politicians who have received large campaign contributions from your clients.
I'm going to dispute that last part, but I would agree with you that there are definitely differences between the legislature and the judiciary. No question.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, it appears I do not have any time, but if I do, I'll yield it back.
Thank you. Chair at this time recognizes Mr. Bartlett, the gentleman from Maryland, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. By way of full disclosure, I would like to note that I think the EPA frequently makes erroneous assumptions which lead to wildly excessive regulations. I think that it's probably not easy to increase greenhouse gases without increasing general air pollution, and I'm having some trouble understanding why everybody wouldn't like to be breathing cleaner air. I gather that most of those who are opposed to the case for global warming, for climate change, would simply like to continue our aggressive exploration and use of fossil fuels. There are three groups that have common cause in the solution that those who are concerned about global warming or climate change have. Of course, the solution to their problem is stop using so many greenhouse gases that emit CO2 and start using alternatives. There are two other groups that have common cause in this. They have very different problems with exactly the same solution. One of those groups is those that are concerned about our national security. We have only 2% of the world's oil. We use 25% of the world's oil. We import about 2/3 of that, and much of that from countries that don't like us a whole lot. The solution to that problem, of course, only one solution to it. That is either find more oil here, and we have been producing less and less oil every year since 1970, so that ain't going to happen in any meaningful terms here, or to move to alternatives. So this group has exactly the same solution to their very different problem. The third group is a group that recognizes that fossil fuels are finite. By the way, the first person, I think, to recognize that, but probably the first person was M. King Hubbert in 1956, who predicted that in 1970 the United States would reach its maximum oil production. We did that right on schedule. And in spite of drilling more oil wells than all the rest of the world put together, today we produce half the oil that we did in 1970. Now, I would submit that, and by 1980 we knew that that had happened, because looking back in 1980 we could see we're already over the other side of Hubbert's Peak. I cannot understand how rational people could just stand by and not conclude that if the United States reached its maximum oil production in 1970, that someday the world was going to reach its maximum oil production. That is a given. The only uncertainty is when would the world reach its maximum oil production, and that is a question that was not asked. There is now abundant evidence that the world has reached its maximum ability to produce oil on a daily basis at about 85 million barrels a day. Obviously, the solution to that problem is to move away from fossil fuels, which just aren't going to be there in the future, and to move to alternatives. So we have these three groups, very different problems, common interest, same solution. Move away from fossil fuels to renewables. Why aren't these three groups locking arms and marching forward? Why are we sitting here today with many of us concerned about national security, a few of us knowledgeable and concerned about peak oil? Why are we here criticizing the premise of others? They may be dead wrong. It's irrelevant to me whether the global warming climate change people are right or wrong, because the solution to their problem is exactly the right solution to two other very real problems. One of those is a national security problem. We have got to move away from fossil fuels in our country. They just aren't there. And the other is the peak oil people who understand that the energy just isn't going to be there. By the way, I led a codel of people, 9 of us went to China just a bit over 4 years ago to talk about energy. They began their discussion of energy by talking about post-oil. And they had a 5-point plan. And the 5th point in that 5-point plan was international cooperation. They knew, as many of you noted, that we can't do it alone. While they plead for international cooperation, they plan that as if there won't be any. Very little time remaining, sir. I would like your comments. And why am I wrong?
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I remember appearing before this committee a couple of years ago, and I enjoyed an interchange with you, and I'm looking forward to it again. I think the main place that I would disagree with you is they are not the same solutions. Climate change in the near term, if this body decided it wanted to make a serious reduction in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, that would, to be cost effective, that would have to be occurring, as Mr. Hall suggested, by reducing the amount of coal that's used for electricity generation. The substitute for that is likely to be natural gas, which is itself, to some extent, produced domestically, but is also something that we import. The solution for climate change has a cost-effective solution for climate change has next to nothing to do with our consumption of oil. So it's it's not a different, so.
I think I talked about fossil fuels generally. Oil we have been following more precisely. Gas is finite, sir. That too will run out. So is coal.
So there are 3 problems. The problem of climate change needs to be addressed over a longer-term period with R&D, and it really largely involves getting off coal for power generation. That doesn't help with the national security part. The national security part, you're right, we need to produce more, we need to use Canadian oil, and we need to get rid of and we need to deal with the regulations like low-carbon fuel standards that could prevent us from using an oil deposit that's larger than Saudi Arabia's and is sitting right north of us. We might think about a gasoline tax to discourage consumption. But peak oil is a problem that the market will take care of. So the problem is there are different solutions to all these real problems.
Just in closing, Mr. Chairman, the market will not take care of peak oil. Remember, I said it here.
Make a note of that. Mr. McNerney, the gentleman from California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I personally want to thank the witnesses for coming today. It's a contentious issue, so it's good to have this interchange. There's going to be some moments, but I appreciate your attendance here this morning and your testimony. Dr. Christy, do you deny that the IPCC process is open and transparent?
I would say the IPCC is not open and transparent, as the experience as a lead author and what went on behind my back as a lead author in that very chapter.
Well, there were 2 major reviews, including your comments in the 2007 report. So that doesn't agree with what you're saying.
Maybe there's confusion here about what peer review is and what IPCC is. The lead authors of the IPCC have what's called review authority. They review their own material.
So the reviews were not, there were no outside reviews of the IPCC?
Oh, there were outside reviews, but remember, after that, there were further edits by the lead authors.
So in previous congressional hearings, you've discussed your processing codes for generating satellite-based estimates of tropospheric temperature change? But when asked if you had made your codes freely available for scrutiny by other scientists, you said that it was too complicated for other scientists to understand. Is that still the case?
No. In fact, we've already released some of the code to the National Climatic Data Center, and by June they will have all the parts. There's about 10 parts, many thousands of lines of codes that they don't understand, and so we're in the process of.
Right. I've been a computer modeler, computer forecaster. I know it's involved, but it's very important that your code be available for others to examine. And so right now, today, you're saying that your code is going to be available and freely transparent for other scientists to examine. Good.
Yes.
Good. Now, you said that the data was fraudulently included in ICC reports. I just heard you say that this morning. Do you still believe that?
I don't believe I said fraudulently.
You said fraudulently. I heard you say it this morning. Fraudulent. I wrote it down. I was shocked that you said that.
I'll have to look at my testimony. I don't remember typing.
It's not in your written testimony. It's in your verbal testimony.
Right. I have that right here. Referring to which part?
Well, I mean,
I don't remember saying
your
it.
conclusion is that there's fraudulent data in the reports. That's what I heard you say this morning.
What I said this morning was biased, false, overconfident, and or misleading.
That was one statement, and you said another statement, and you included fraudulent. So,
well, okay, we can look at the tape on that, but
all right, I'm going to move on here.
If you have a question about the particular thing I was talking about, I'd be happy to answer it.
Well, I'm going to move on. Mr. Montgomery, or Dr. Montgomery, excuse me. You criticized studies suggesting that forward-thinking climate policies will create jobs, suggesting that the studies are a product of a biased group. But it's well documented that large oil companies spent massive amounts funding the studies that question climate science. Now, isn't it true that you served as an expert eyewitness on behalf of ExxonMobil, and which, according to one well-known report, spent $16 million funding initiatives to spark doubt on climate science?
I can't quite put that together, but I have testified as an expert witness on entirely unrelated issues about market shares in regard to other. Sorry, I have testified as an expert witness on behalf of ExxonMobil on entirely unrelated cases that has absolutely nothing to do with my opinions here. Nor have I stated in any, and I think I probably should have done as Mr. Glaser pointed out, that I'm appearing today on my own behalf. I am not being compensated by anyone for this testimony. I am stating my own opinions, and I don't expect to be paid attention to here because of who I represent. I expect it to be because of the logic of the arguments that I present.
Well, you said that there's no benefit to the U.S. for taking action on climate change.
I believe that is a conclusion that I am perfectly happy to discuss with you at greater length. The point of that is that what the U.S. will do.
My personal experience contradicts that, because I've worked in the wind energy field. We created technology here in the United States, and it went to Germany because they had climate policies that encouraged local utility companies to buy those wind turbines. We're now buying their manufactured products, manufactured by Germans. We're buying that product in the United States. So, no, I disagree.
And you are doing exactly what I described in my testimony. You are telling precisely half the story. You are not looking at what the people who are producing those wind turbines would have been doing if there were not a renewable portfolio standard that put them to work producing equipment that is a more expensive way of producing electricity than the alternative. They would have been producing other things which would have led to a higher level of GDP and no difference in employment. That's an economic argument. I'm perfectly happy to carry it out, but it has nothing to do with whether Exxon funds bad science. It is an argument about economics, and it is an argument about facts and data, not about who pays for what.
Research money that was spent in this United States is now developing products, is now manufacturing products in Germany because they had policies that encouraged them to buy wind power and green power. So
actually what is happening is exactly what I described in my testimony. The U.S. is creating a demand for renewable energy, but actually China is producing it because they are subsidizing their industries, and that is so well documented that we filed a 301B case against them.
Right, and they're going to be importing their product to us as well.
Yeah, they're going to be exporting it to us, but they're going to be exporting it to us because we have regulations that force people to use it, and we have higher costs of producing it than they do.
Well, I guess my time's up.
Final question you want to close with? You've been
Mr. Chairman, I don't even know where to begin with my next question. So.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Mr. McNair. Chair at this time recognizes Dr. Brown, gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll direct my questions to Dr. Christy, but I'm from Georgia, and if the others on the panel want an interpreter, I'm sure the committee will be glad to provide you an interpreter. Dr. Christy, in your testimony, you speak at great lengths about process issues associated with climate science in general. The process is used by some at the University of East Anglia's Climate Research Unit and the IPCC as a whole. As a scientist who actually builds data sets and as someone who has witnessed what you call, quote, my side bias, unquote, or, quote, groupthink, unquote, would you trust data from individuals trying to hide the decline, quote, unquote, redefine peer review when inconvenient, and destroy documents rather than comply with the law?
I wouldn't. But I would say that because the process has become more open, that I think those doing these data sets now are a little bit more concerned about the fact that they will be exposed if they do make any mistakes.
I hope so. We've seen all those emails, but several relating to the state of the underlying computer code haven't received as much attention. The desperate emails of a computer programmer offer us a glimpse into the data control issues at CRU with quotes such as, quote, what the hell is supposed to happen here? Oh, yeah, there is no, quote, supposed. I can make it up, so I have. Another quote. You can't imagine what this has cost me to actually allow the operator to assign false WMO codes. But what else is there in such situations, especially when dealing with a master database of dubious provenance? The next quote. Oh, well, F-bomb. That's not what it says here. Oh, F this. It's Sunday evening. I've worked all weekend, and just when I thought it was done, I'm hitting yet another problem that's based on the hopeless state of our databases. Next quote. Quote, this whole project is such a mess. In his testimony, Dr. Emanuel states that all of this is nonsense, just as he did before any review was actually conducted. Has any review of the ClimateGate issue actually addressed the underlying science?
Well, I think the exoneration panels that have occurred have not addressed the underlying science nor the actions of the people there. You don't have the typical things you do in legal proceedings where you cross-examine the evidence and witnesses and anyone can be called to testify and so on. That has not occurred. Your description of those computer programs, as a programmer myself who has written thousands and thousands of lines of code on these very kind of station records, and Dr. Muller probably understands this too, is that it is a nightmare looking through data coming from different countries in different formats and mistakes that are made, Fahrenheit, centigrade, missing 100 or something like that. It's really problematic.
So it's all a mess, obviously. Has any review of the ClimateGate issue addressed the entirety of the allegations that were raised?
Oh, not in my opinion. I think much more could be done, but hopefully the peer review literature as we go along will just make that unnecessary. I hope we just get to the point we can trust what we publish these days.
As a scientist myself, I hope so too. Do you believe in an independent review of these allegations is warranted?
I would rather see just an independent assessment of climate as the IPCC has done, but without the IPCC cadre, the establishment. I think you could have a very reputable and credible report that would come to somewhat different conclusions than the IPCC has.
Well, as a scientist, again, I hope we do that. To the best of your knowledge, has the IPCC adopted all of the recommendations from the IAC review conducted last summer?
Well, obviously not, because the first thing they recommended was that the head leave, and he is still the head. So starting from there, they have not.
Very good. I have just a half a minute left. Dr. Emanuel, it should be noted that MIT received $100 million from the Kochs for Cancer Research Institute. MIT is a prestigious organization with a world-class reputation in science, but according to logic we are witnessing here today, its research should be dismissed because it receives any funding from the organization that the party dislikes. Would you agree with that? Have y'all?
What are you asking me?
I'm asking you about. Have y'all received? Have you received
Yes.
funding?
MIT has, yes. I don't, of course, do cancer research, but I'm well aware of what you're saying. Yeah.
So in other words, the calling in question people who are entities that have received funding, seems that some would call their testimony into question today, and I just wanted to point out that y'all have too. Thank you very much. My time's expired. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Chair. Doctor. This time recognize Mrs. Edwards. Yeah, Mrs. Edwards from Maryland, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What a shock. I thought I wasn't quite up yet. I just want to clarify for the record that I have here, and we've entered these into the record before, Mr. Chairman, 7 scientific, independent reports that have evaluated this question of, as some describe, ClimateGate emails that have really exonerated these individuals in question in terms of their research and research capacity. And I just think that we need to get off of this and really get down to the real questions in front of us. I just want to be clear, and each of you can answer this individually. I want to be clear whether any of you have been paid or compensated for any of your research, analyses, testimony, or speech in any form at any entity by a company or trade association that's represented by the oil, coal, or energy industry. Dr. Armstrong? That's a yes or no.
Well, I received $3,000 from the state of Alaska for a report, but that did not result in a
I asked
published
about
paper.
the industry, not a state government.
Yeah,
by
no,
any and
I
one
pay my way down
industry.
here. I've
Thanks
had no-
so much. Dr. Muller?
Yes.
And who paid you, and how much?
I'm sorry, I don't have those figures available.
Who paid you?
No. I have been a consultant for BP. I have done a lot of work for does the U.S. Department of Energy count? They've given me a lot of funding.
Company, trade association, with the industry, with the oil, coal, or energy industry.
I believe it's really hard to pull this out without anticipation.
Please submit for our record any compensation that you've received from the oil, coal, or energy industry for the work that you do. Thanks so much, Dr.
I believe
Muller.
it was only BP, and that was
Just submit it for the record, Dr. Christy.
Now, please, let him answer, please.
He doesn't. He can't pull it out of his head, and I would like it for the record, and that's true. If you can't just remember it, I'd appreciate it if you could submit it for the record. Dr. Christy?
No.
Mr. Glaser?
As an attorney, I have represented and been compensated by energy industry companies.
Thank you.
That's a fact.
Dr. Emanuel?
No.
Dr. Montgomery?
As an individual, I cannot remember ever being compensated directly. Of course, I've made my living for 20 years as a consultant doing a very large number of things, and my company had as clients just about every company in the United States, just about every large company in the United States, including energy companies.
Great. I'd appreciate if you would submit that for our record, your compensation from representatives, trade associations, or corporations associated with the oil, coal, or energy industry. Thank you very much.
May I answer your question? I believe that what I said was that I have received no direct compensation. My company's the company's records, I am no longer an employee there, and I have absolutely no way of providing you with information about what Charles River Associates received over the years, and I am sure they would object to it in any event, but I cannot do that.
And you haven't received any compensation as a consultant for any of those in the industry?
My salary is paid by Charles River Associates, or was paid by Charles River Associates, and I have not received direct compensation as an individual from anyone except Charles River Associates for about 20 years.
Thank you very much. Just as my time is running out, I think that in any field of science, there's a continual study of science. We see breakthroughs, we see setbacks. There's an evaluation process that goes forward, and we never stop asking questions because that's the nature of science. And so I think we have to be willing to change policy, change direction, continue that kind of analysis because you never quite get to the end to it. We look at those things all the time here on this committee. I represent a district where the county that I live in is the home to NASA Goddard and also to NOAA. They play a really important role in the analysis and use of climate research, and it's important to me that, and should be important to people here, that we keep this investment in the field of climate research in our monitoring capacity and satellite capabilities and research abilities, because otherwise I share the view of my colleague from Maryland, Dr. Bartlett, that we're never going to solve these big problems by just burying our heads in the sand. And just as I close here, for the scientists who are on the panel, Doctors Muller, Christy, and Emanuel, I hope that you would agree that we need to continue investments in climate research, even though you might quibble about whether your minority view was included in a particular evaluation or assessment. And with that, I yield.
Gentlelady does a good job of representing her district, and she went right exactly 5 minutes. Dr. Armstrong, did you get to answer her question?
Yes, I did. The answer is no.
You yield back, Ms. Edwards. You want to follow up anything?
No, Dr. Armstrong did answer the question first.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Harris is next. Recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing today. First, Dr. Emanuel, thank you very much for appearing here. Your summary of written testimony number 5 is there is no scientific basis for the confidence expressed by some that the effects of climate change will be benign. Do you believe the converse is true, too, that there is no clear scientific basis for the confidence expressed by some that the effects of climate change will be risky?
I don't tend to believe anybody who's confident about this at all.
Okay, well then, thank you. In your statement, though, you actually say, in your very statement, the first paragraph, you said, it is incumbent on us to take seriously the risks that climate change poses. It doesn't say climate change might pose. It says climate change poses. And actually, you also say, with regards to the report by the Department of Defense, that the U.S. should commit to a stronger national and international role to help stabilize climate change at levels that will avoid significant disruption to global security and stability, clearly implying that there will be significant disruption to global security and stability. So are you skeptical about those statements as well, which don't say might do it or?
Well, Representative Harris, I think there's a confusion between a forecast and an assessment of risk. If I say that I feel that there's certain risk of my house burning down and buy an insurance policy, I'm not forecasting either that my house will burn down or not burn down. But I would take seriously any actuarial information that gave me information about the probabilities of risk. That's what I'm referring to.
Thank you very much. Mr. Glaser, you make a great point, I think, that public health, if you graph use of energy and use of greenhouse gases versus public health, you probably also see an advantage in that. For instance, I assume that what you mean by that is that when we mean increased greenhouse gas, we mean use of energy. We produce energy so that we do things like have energy for refrigeration, which has made great public health advances, keeping food safe. We have energy to, buy gas for ambulances or diesel for ambulances that actually bring people to a hospital a little quicker in an emergency. Or, we have MRIs at our hospital with these huge electric cables going into them. I'm assuming that, energy does good things. It doesn't just do bad things. Is that your point, that these good things aren't taken into consideration?
Yes, I think that's exactly my point. And it's not a coincidence that the 20th century witnessed an explosion in all of the benefits that we consider to be a part of modern life. At the same time, the greenhouse gas emissions were increasing. The underlying cause is the same. The underlying cause is the use of energy. 85% of the energy we use in the United States comes from fossil fuels.
Sure.
That's where the energy comes from.
No, thank you. That's what I thought your point was. Dr. Montgomery, to close with you, we've got this situation in our state, and you mentioned about how frequently the economic cost of these subsidized, creating these greenhouse jobs and these things like, we've got a situation in our state where there's a move to put offshore wind farms, which would require a economic subsidy. Interestingly enough, the bill that's now in front of our legislature would cap somehow the cost of that you could add to someone's electric bill when you build a windmill, as though, I guess we could pass a law that says everybody ought to pay $10 a month for electric. I mean, I guess that's the same economic sense. But let me summarize what it sounds like to me what we're doing with some of these subsidies, particularly in what we're going to do off our coast if this passes. We're going to borrow money from the Chinese to pay for these subsidies because we have no money here. We're broke. We borrow money. China is our biggest external lender now. So we're going to buy these funds from the Chinese, perhaps to buy either German or Chinese windmills, because as the congressman from California suggested, these really aren't made in the United States predominantly. And then we're going to place them in our economy, causing our electric prices to go up, then placing us at competitive disadvantage to China. So we borrow the money from China, we buy the windmill from China, and then we pay more for domestic electric, putting our homes and our businesses at competitive disadvantage. Is that kind of what you're getting along when you say, when we create these green jobs that sound good, when you scratch a little deeper, what you see are real problems in a global competitive world economy?
Yes, Mr. Rice, I'd say that is correct. That Congress and regulators can move around who pays for something, but they can't make the cost disappear. And the cost to the United States of these subsidies is basically more expensive forms of generation that provide exactly the same service of making MRI machines work, but that are absorbing resources that otherwise could be used for producing something that people will enjoy and be able to use.
That's what I thought. And how can you imagine, how can you cap the cost of you build a windmill that costs a certain amount to produce energy. Exactly how do you cap that cost legislate? I mean, as an economist, this must be frustrating to you because in the laws of the marketplace, there's no way to cap a cost.
No,
is that your impression?
If you require a company that's under your jurisdiction to do something and then say you can only charge for this less than it cost you, it's either a taking or you are simply saying their shareholders are going to pay for it, and their shareholders are everybody.
Sure, that's what I thought. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
All right, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Clark, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry.
Yes. There's a letter that's been presented to the minority staff from the majority staff. It's a letter from a Mr. Anthony Watts that he requested would be read and entered into the record of the hearing. And as I understand it, the letter purports to try to set straight some errors that Professor Muller made in his testimony. This is highly unusual for the committee to receive a correction to a witness's testimony before the testimony has even been delivered to the committee. So my question is it your intention to enter this document into the record?
It's my understanding we've not yet asked it to be in the testimony.
Well, okay.
Is that the basis of your inquiry?
We would like to know if it's because since we heard his testimony without the corrections, is this going to be entered into the record? And has Dr. Mueller even seen this document? Does he want to add comment to the record? And how does this impact his testimony?
Is that a question addressed to me?
I'm asking, this is between the chairman and myself. The chairman that I love very much and myself.
Yeah, you're showing it.
Well, that's what keeps you on edge.
You've done everything but backhand me. Oh, I respect this lady very much, and she knows it. I understand that you have seen it and you have the letter. Now, are you asking now to submit it into the record?
No, we want to know if you're going to submit it into the record and if it's appropriate.
I don't even know what it says. Why would I
that's the
submit
point.
it into the record?
I mean, Congressman Miller was told his testimony. I mean, he had something to add into the record. You hadn't seen it yet,
Yeah.
so you said no. It couldn't go into the record until you'd read it.
And
Is that the
Councilman
same
Miller is a
answer?
very famous lawyer from his district, and he knows that when we say we haven't seen it yet, that we hadn't seen it yet. He didn't question that.
You haven't seen this yet either. So
I haven't seen it yet, so it's not admissible into the record.
That's what we want. Thank you.
Now, do you want to put it in the record? Would you like to put it in the record?
No, sir.
All right, the lady withdraws her request. Who's next? Mr. Clark, I would recognize you for the second time. That doesn't mean you have 10 minutes, but we're going to be. You've been very patient with us, so we recognize you at this time, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the reason why I'm patient, because I firsthand have seen the pain and suffering caused by the decline of our market share of U.S. manufactured vehicles in the United States, a market share that we lost to Asian imports. I represent Metro Detroit. I'm born and raised in Detroit, and we knew that this threat was coming and that we had to be competitive. But those concerns weren't effectively heeded, and young guys like me back in the 80s couldn't even get a job in the auto plants because there wasn't anything available. That's why I'm very grateful that this administration did provide aid to General Motors, and now they have seen 4 consecutive quarters of profitability, and I believe that that's evidence that the taxpayers' investment is going to pay off. But in the same way, I'm concerned right now that we could be missing a huge opportunity to export great new green energy technology globally. And I'm concerned because of recent findings that for the very first time, U.S. investment in new green energy technology has now fallen from first place globally. Now China is in first place. Not only that, we're not even in second place. Germany is. We're now in third place. Some of you have indicated in your testimony that you believe that green jobs is just a pipe dream. Here's my concern with that. You've got great companies like General Electric. They're investing very heavily now in wind, in solar, in energy efficiency. You have corporate CEOs, such as the CEO in GE, stating that we're at risk of losing out to other countries like China. Is China wrong to invest? Is Germany wrong? Are executives like the CEO of General Electric working contrary to their bottom line when they say we've got to invest in new green energy technology? I welcome any of your feedback on this.
If I could start, have spent some time in my career looking at various forms of industrial policy. I think where I would start is a quotation from Professor Richard Smallensee, who was Dean of the Sloan School at MIT. We can't regulate our way into prosperity. If we feel that the United States economy does not need the government to tell each industry or to provide industries with regulations and subsidies in order to make them succeed. Our economy grows on its own, and industries depend on the government to create a market for themselves at their own risk. And this is what we have seen consistently in the past when we have tried to create industries, either in the United States or other countries, through industrial policy. Denmark decided to take the lead on wind energy. Its wind energy industry has collapsed and has moved almost exclusively to China. China is an enigma. China has clearly decided to put subsidies into one particular industry. But I remember the fear that our that we were going to collapse as an economy if we didn't fight off the Japanese effort to produce high-definition TVs back in the 80s when I was at the Congressional Budget Office. It was a terrible decision for Japan to make. They lost tons of money on it. The industry was nowhere near ready to go on technology. I think it's critically important for the U.S. to invest in R&D, but I see no reason that a company like General Electric would want to. Okay.
But I appreciate what you're saying. Back many decades ago, after the Wright brothers, with their great innovation and creating a flight, we lost competitiveness to Europe in terms of airplane technology. President Wilson decided to respond, and we subsidized air mail routes, which resulted in the growth of air flight technology here in the U.S. Same with Bell Labs and their technology in semiconductors. It was the U.S. military that was their strongest customer. So in light of that track record, we've got to compete. We can't lose this opportunity. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Kravac, gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for all our distinguished people that are involved in this today. I'd like to start off with Dr. Christy. Dr. Christy, you seem to be of my genre. And back when I was graduating from high school, I remember the great global cooling. Is this great global cooling very similar to the great global warming that is going on today?
Well, I don't know what you mean by genre. I do have 4 grandkids, but in this sense, yes. Our ignorance about the climate system is just enormous, and we have much to learn and much to do.
Yeah. I remember the time I was going through high school, the polar caps were going to expand and the whole world was going to flip upside down and everything else. It's kind of funny how history just repeats itself. Except instead of freezing to death, we're all going to fry. So it's amazing how this has gone through. I'd also like to talk to Dr. Montgomery, if I could. Sir, I come from Minnesota and the 8th District of Minnesota, which is a very proud tradition of mining. Can you tell me how this regulation of CO2 is going to affect mining operations within the United States?
For the next decade or two, there's no way to achieve deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions without substantially cutting down the use of coal for power generation. Every ton of coal that's not burned in a power plant is a ton of coal that's not going to be mined. So it translates directly. Best we can see is a valley of death for the coal industry, in which after shrinking back as gas and other technologies replace coal in the short run, it might be able to revive if clean technologies like carbon capture and sequestration come along in the future. That could be avoided with a different pace of control, but in the next decade or so, coal mining is going to be where the reductions occur.
Okay, thank you, sir. Dr. Christy, if I can bounce back to you again. If all the United States, we go totally green, but other countries throughout this world, they don't follow suit. Can you tell me what kind of tick that's even going to put on the CO2 emissions?
Well, I've run those scenarios for a number of different situations, and you're looking at most at 1/10 of a degree after 100 years.
So 1/10 of a degree after 100 years.
Yes,
Okay.
and the global temperature changes by more than that from month to month.
Okay. And could you positively state that because of what the United States going totally green would actually commit to that 1/10 of a degree?
That's a good point, that you might claim it's 1/10 of a degree, but you never could devise an experiment to attribute it to your legislative action.
Okay. All right, sir. So, Dr. Montgomery, back to you now, sir. So for that 1/10 of a degree that we're not sure that actually was attributed by the United States going totally green, can you tell me the economic impact that would have upon the United States if we're the only ones that went green and the rest of the world did not?
Yes, I have to look back in my memory for a study that was comparable to what Dr. Christy is talking about, but I would say the kind of work we did last year on the Waxman-Markey bill would suggest costs in the range of $1,000 to $2,000 per household, a loss of 1 to 2 percentage points of GDP, what it would be otherwise, and perhaps close to a doubling of electricity prices.
Could you even comment on the amount of jobs that would be lost within the United States of America?
Well, I'm not sure about jobs, but I can say that the impact on compensation to workers would be really substantial. Some industries it would happen in the form of lower wages, keeping people at work. Other industries where that can't happen, people would be losing their jobs. But it would be a couple of percentage points off the total compensation to labor, and kind of figure out how much of that is job loss in the long run and how much of it is just you have less money to take home in your paycheck.
Okay. All right, sir. I think, Mr. Chairman, I think I've answered my questions. I yield back my 32 seconds, sir.
Thank you. And do you recollect when Dr. Holden was here? He's the president's advisor on the sea level rise. That his testimony was that it would rise 12 feet, you know, when the ice all falls and melts into the ocean. And the proper person measured it. As you know, the very next year, the so-called gold standard of scientific consensus by global warming advocates projected that the oceans would rise between 7 and 23 inches. So that's who's advising the president. That's the reason we're in all the trouble we're in right now over all this. Does that help your record any?
Well, I just we just can't let a crisis go to waste, sir. So there you go.
Thank you. All right. Now, we recognize. Recognize the gentlelady from California. 5 minutes,
Mr. Chairman.
10 minutes, whatever she wants. Ms. Woolsey is a very valuable member of this committee and gives me an awful lot of trouble, but I respect her highly.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this morning the Democratic caucus had the privilege of hearing from and asking questions of Dr. Stephen Chu, the Secretary of Energy. And then I came right from there up here. I feel like I am living in a parallel universe. I mean, it's got my head going boing, boing, boing. It's tough. So my first question is based on Dr. Armstrong's testimony. He said, Dr. Armstrong, you said, I believe, that EPA's decision to ban DDT was based on bad science. So I'd like to ask the rest of you, would you reintroduce DDT into our world now, today, if you could? Doctor,
You're not asking
yes
me.
or no?
You're not.
Oh, no, I think I got, you said no. You thought we should not have done what we did in the first place. I can ask you, would you reintroduce it? Sure, I'd be glad to. I just didn't want to waste your time. Just yes or no?
Yes, I definitely would.
Would reintroduce it. Okay, Dr. Muller?
DDT, yeah.
It is way beyond my credentials to answer that professionally. I have read books on the subject, or rather articles on the subject, and I think I've seen a reasonable case that introducing it would actually save lives.
Dr. Christy?
I lived in Africa, saw people die of malaria. Absolutely, yes.
Mr. Glaser?
I have no idea and have no opinion.
Dr. Emanuel?
Far beyond my expertise.
Dr. Montgomery?
I've read a good bit on the subject. Roger Bate, I think, is a great expert. I agree with Dr. Christy. Millions and millions of children and poor people in Africa are dying because of the lack of DDT as an effective way of getting rid of disease vectors.
Well, okay, I didn't want to go too much farther on this, except I served on the Africa World Health Subcommittee. We have just about, using other technologies and other methodologies, done away with malaria if we provide the right preventions for African people, like we would have had to provide DDT. So I think it's proven itself, from my opinion. Dr. Emanuel, I understand that you've not always, that you weren't born recognizing the link between greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So how did you get to where you are today? How did you form your current beliefs on climate change?
Well, Representative Woolsey, science is based on evidence, and evidence is often ambiguous. It evolves with time. It changes. Science progresses, but it doesn't progress monotonically. It goes up and down. In the 80s, when I first started to study the issue of climate change, back in those days, I didn't feel that the evidence was conclusive. I didn't have the opinion that this wasn't happening or otherwise. But in the intervening 20 years, because of the wonderful work done in paleoclimatology, to some extent because of models, my own involvement with the physics, radiative transfer, convective heat transfer, I and many of my colleagues came to the conclusion that the evidence was very strong for this. And let me take the opportunity to say that one has to distinguish between what groups of scientists come to over a long period of time and what a few say that get amplified by the press. We heard that there was no difference between the scare of cooling in the 70s and the concern with warming. That couldn't be further from the truth. To the best of my knowledge, not one scientific organization back in those days raised any alarm. It was a few scientists expressed some concern, amplified hugely by a big cover in Time magazine. It's not comparable to today, not at all right? One should not make that mistake. Mr. Chairman, I think you misquoted Mr. Holdren. He was referring to what would happen if all of Greenland's ice disappeared. That is not projected to happen, but his numbers are correct. If it did, we would see a sea level rise of about 22 feet. Unfortunately, it is a risk. It's way out there because we don't understand the physics of ice, but I think that's what he was referring to.
We'll add on to your time. We won't take from you the time, but in a recent interview, Dr. Holdren was sitting right where you are there, and I told him he stated that the Republicans need to be educated on the issue. And in August of 2006 interview with the BBC News, he reportedly said that if the current pace of change continued, a catastrophic sea level rise of 4 meters, that's 13 feet, not 12 feet, I was wrong, was within the realm of possibility. And while you were going to the interview, how sure were you about your prediction? And the hard, cold facts were at the very next year, the so-called gold standard of scientific consensus by global warming advocates projected that the oceans would rise between 7 and 23 inches between now and 2100. How sure was the scientific community of their prediction? That's my recollection of it. You probably know more about it than I do.
I would only simply add to that the IPCC, in making that projection, very explicitly excluded any calculation of the melting of land ice. I think they were wise to do that because we don't understand the physics very well.
All I was trying to emphasize was that he guessed at 13 feet and he's just 12 feet wrong.
I think his statement that it was within the realm of possibility is correct.
Math. I'm not very good on math. There's three things I couldn't do, and that's add and subtract.
I think the notion that it's within the realm of possibility is correct on his part. It's different from a projection.
You made your point. You made a good point. You've been a good witness. I'm sorry I haven't been as good a chairman.
Oh. On that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield the remainder of my time.
Okay, now let's see. We have Mo Brooks from Alabama, a gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been most entertaining seeing you folks act up on the higher row. Dr. Christy, would it be fair to say that pretty much the one constant about the weather is that it's always changing?
The climate is always changing.
And in looking at Earth's climatological data, have there been cooler periods than what we're now experiencing?
Yes.
And do you have any way of expressing a judgment as to how often the world has experienced cooler periods than what we're now incurring?
If you go back through the entire history of the world, most of the periods have not been cooler than today. They've been warmer.
Well, let's get into the warmer periods. Have there been warmer periods?
Yes, much warmer, yes.
And do you have any way of expressing a judgment as to how often during whatever period of time you want to use that it has been warmer than what it is today?
I cannot give you a percentage of time, but it's just to say most. I can't call up that graph in my brain right now.
And looking at the materials that y'all handed to us, and this one is by Dr. Christy, I'm going to read part of it. To compound this sad and deceptive situation, I have been quite impressed with some recent results by Dahl Jensen et al., in which Greenland ice borehole temperatures had been deconvolved into a time series covering the past 20,000 years. This measurement indeed presented inter-century variations. Their result indicated a clear 500-year period of temperatures warmer than the present, centered around 900 AD, commonly referred to as the medieval warming period. When it says, quote, warmer than the present, end quote, does that mean that consistently for that 5-century period of time, according to the Greenland ice borehole measurements, we'd had a global warming period then?
Yes, in the smooth and averaged period, about a century smoothing, each one of those centuries are considered to be warmer than the present.
So the temperatures that we're experiencing right now, do you consider them to be an aberration or just a part of the Earth's normal warming and cooling cycle?
I think most of all they're part of the normal ups and downs of climate.
And do you have a judgment as to what has been the warmest climatological year in the past 2 or 3 decades?
That would be in the bulk atmosphere in 1998.
And would it be fair to say then that there has been a cooling of global temperatures at least over the last 13 years compared to 1998?
Well, I can say that there certainly hasn't been a warming of temperature since that time.
And the last 4 or 5 years, have they been cooler or warmer?
They've been up and down. Now, some have been cold, some have been warm.
And Congressman Kravac kind of jumped on some turf I wanted to hit on. It's nice to have these little cell phones where you can pull up things, and I couldn't help but pull up the Time magazine front page article dated April 28, 1975, where we have a penguin on the cover, and it says, quote, "How to Survive the Coming Ice Age," end quote. And those were the days back when I was on the Grissom High School and Duke University debate teams back in the early 70s. Of course, this was one of the topics that came up from time to time in extemporaneous speaking, so I happen to recall that. For you young folks, I envy you not having that recollection, but for us older folks, you know, we can remember that far back. How do you compare that global cooling claim versus today's global warming claim? Is there any consistency or inconsistency?
Well, I think the consistency there is, like I said before, there's a large amount of ignorance about the climate system, and that's just the way it is. It's such a complicated system. I think there's been too much jumping to conclusions about seeing something happen in the climate and saying, well, the only way that could happen is human effects. When you look at the possibility of natural unforced variability, you see that can cause excursions that we've seen recently.
Would it be fair to say then that within the scientific community, it literally is asking too much of them for them to be able to tell us whether 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, Earth's temperatures are going to be warmer or cooler, much like it is pretty unreasonable to ask a meteorologist whether we're going to have rain in Washington just 2 or 3 weeks from now?
Well, there are some differences in that kind of thing, but I do yield to Dr. Emanuel over here in the sense I agree with him that it is very risky making predictions that far out.
Well, if I could just make this one concluding statement, in my judgment, based upon what I've heard and learned over the decades, the fact of the matter is nobody knows whether we're going to have global cooling or global warming over the next half century or century, but we're being asked to undermine America's economy based on this guesswork, speculation, and surmise. And we need to be very careful as a Congress before we start eliminating jobs that people in our nation so badly need. And with that having been said, I very much appreciate the time each of y'all have spent with us today.
You yield back your time. Was Dr. Armstrong trying to get his attention? Okay. Anyone else? Thank you, Mo. Thank you for your good questions. Chair at this time recognizes a very patient Mr. Sarbanes, and you won't be last today. The gentleman from Maryland, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. Your testimony is helpful, and this is a complicated issue. I wondered who among you would be prepared to declare that climate change is not happening. Is there anyone at the table who would say that? Okay.
Do you mean in either direction? Or, I mean, my position is it's just as likely to go up as down, so, and I'm sure it's going to change. It's absolutely certain it's going to change.
Okay, but you're not refuting the notion that climate change is occurring. Okay.
Definitely not.
And who among you would dispute that human activity has some role to play in climate change? Okay. What's interesting to me about the testimony is when I look at each of the witnesses, Dr. Christy, you clearly have concerns about the IPCC, the process, whether they're taking into account all the things that they should, including some of the things that you've urged upon them and so forth. But you don't appear to reject out of hand the possibility that human activity can be a factor in climate change. You're not predicting it necessarily one way or the other, but you're not rejecting that out of hand. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Carbon dioxide is increasing. That will have some effect.
And then, Dr. Muller, you also had some concerns about the IPCC, but appeared to recognize climate change as very real, as being caused or heavily driven by the greenhouse gas emissions. I accept your point that it's fair to worry about whether other countries are going to take steps to meet this challenge, and whether we're sort of going to be out there on our own if we push forward, and that's a subject for discussion and formulation of policy. But you've clearly acknowledged climate change and a human activity component to that.
That's correct.
Okay.
The degree of the human component is, in my mind, quite uncertain.
Right. And Mr. Armstrong, you also challenged the IPCC. Obviously, that's one of the parts of the agenda here today, is to raise questions, and I'm going to come back to that. But again, don't appear to be dismissing, as you just indicated, not dismissing out of hand the connection of climate change and potential human activities influence there. Dr. Glaser, you're a lawyer. I mean, Dr. Glaser, you're a lawyer. Well, you are a lawyer. You are a doctor. But you're not really here to speak to the science so much as raise questions about the EPA and the Clean Air Act and all the rest of it. And Dr. Montgomery, you're focusing on the economics, but again, don't appear to be issuing a major challenge to the underlying science when it comes to climate change and the potential connection to that of human activity. So I think it's important for us to recognize this. It's fair to raise questions and have a debate on the process by which we're trying to reach some good judgment as we make policy with respect to climate change. But the public needs to understand that climate change is real, that human activity is a contributing factor to that, and that it's fair to gather up that kind of information going forward. Now, Dr. Emanuel, I'd like to ask you, what emerges to me from these discussions of what, some mistakes that were made by some of the folks involved with the IPCC, and it's, we can say that, but what I get the impression of is that the IPCC, can take it, that this is a group that, is made up of a significant number of scientists that participate, over almost 200 countries that participate. and they recognize the importance of the work they do, and they're going to make corrections to try to make sure going forward that they're an important resource. My time's running out, but I did want you to confirm for me that in addition to the IPCC being a robust source of expertise with respect to climate change, there are others that we rely on, because the suggestion was made earlier in the hearing that we're sort of putting all our eggs in one basket. There's the Inter-Academy Council, is there not, which has issued some important recommendations with respect to climate change, and there's the U.S. Global Change Research Program, among many others that are there as well. Can you just confirm that there's a lot of different and independent sources of conveying this real concern about climate change?
There are indeed, and let me simply remind the committee that the IPCC is not a research organization. It communicates published research. We could throw away the IPCC. We throw away that one graph that some people are focused on, that had one piece of one curve emitted. Throw it all away. The evidence remains very strong, very robust, and very worrying. And anyone who says that we shouldn't be worried is just kidding himself. Is the outcome certain? You've heard here, we all agree it is not. But to suggest that we're not facing a significant risk going forward, and that we should not sacrifice immediate economic goals in order to deal with that risk, I think is being colossally irresponsible.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just respond. Mr. Sarbanes characterized his view of what I'm saying here, and I just want to be precise about this. My view on the science is that the record that the Environmental Protection Agency created in the endangerment finding does not provide a basis for EPA to make that endangerment finding and therefore to regulate. And I don't want my silence otherwise to be construed otherwise. Thank you.
I think your emphasis is what I believe Mr. Sarbanes is saying, that this hearing really is about process. And then that's what we'd hope it'd be about, because that's the only honest way to approach it. And Mr. Sarbanes, you can add on to any question or statements you want to make.
I'll yield back my time.
All right, now thank you. Gentleman yields back, recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Sandy Adams.
Thank you, Mr.
For
Chair.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do want to talk about the economics of it based on our economy today and the fact that I don't believe that there's I think there's some kind of correlation between the regulation, the unemployment rate, the high spending rates in the Congress. All of this is going up at record rates together. Our debt, our deficit, I think it's all correlated together. Dr. Montgomery, I want to discuss a few questions with you, and it is on the economic side because, as many of my colleagues have said, we are broke. We are looking at it. We have a high record of unemployment. People are making very hard, tough decisions in their homes today on how to pay the bills, and if they can't pay all the bills, then how to prioritize their bills. So with that, I have a couple of questions. I want to know if any of your data that you've used to formulate your opinions about the economic impacts of the climate related to regulations have ever been called into question.
No. Economists, like other researchers, have disagreements about the emphasis to put on different things. But the models and the data that we have used have been accepted in major peer-reviewed groups. We have published them. We have argued, but they have been accepted by all of our colleagues and I think the academic community.
Okay. Does the so-called danger posed to the economy by not acting to reduce what some call man-made effects on climate change outweigh the economic costs to the country, in your opinion?
No, it does not.
Will the proposals that we have heard about from this administration, such as the cap-and-trade regime, create jobs and stimulate the U.S. economy?
No, it will not.
Will it lose jobs? Will it cost jobs?
In the short run, I think you raised all of the right issues, that we are looking at a problem of deficits that are hanging over the economy and discouraging investment because of the prospect we have to pay them back someday. We have to pay more taxes. I think that the onslaught of additional regulatory requirements are imposing costs on business and making them unwilling to hire. And I think that adding additional regulations at this point is going to have an effect on employment. In the long run, people are going to have work. People are going to find work. The question is, how much will they be producing and how much will they be earning for it, and how much does the country as a whole get out of their effort? And that, clearly, climate change regulations will diminish.
And we've already been at a record high of months, coinciding months, side by side, of unemployment. So this would just add to it, is basically on the short term.
Yes, and if I could add to that, there have been a number of claims that we need to have environmental regulations because it's a way of getting more spending to happen. If we need more spending, which I would question in terms of our overall fiscal policy, then that's the issue. And the issue needs to be looked at in terms of fiscal policy and whether it makes sense or not. Using regulatory measures to force businesses to spend money on things that we cannot justify for other reasons does not make sense as a stimulus measure.
And I think earlier someone asked you about if we were in the U.S. to bring our carbon emissions down to zero within 20 years and invest all of this, even though countries such as China and India and the EU do not, there would not be much of a difference in what is going on today, correct?
We would not notice the difference to the U.S. in anything that was happening to us because of climate.
If the Kerry-Boxer bill, which was rightly rejected by last year's Congress, had passed and we were on track to lower U.S. emissions by 20% below 2007 levels by 2020, do you think the economic damage created by that bill would have been worth the carbon emissions decrease it was estimated to achieve?
No, because they were very similar. They were very similar, very small reductions to ones that I mentioned and that Dr. Christy mentioned. That the costs of that by itself would have far outweighed any benefit we could have gotten from those minuscule changes.
I'm going to quickly conclude with these two questions. How much of an investment in research and development initiatives would you estimate is necessary for us to cut its emissions in half by 2035, our emissions? And if we were successful, how much would global emissions decrease as a result of that success?
I have no idea of what it would take for R&D, and I'm not sure that 2035 is a target that R&D would get us to in any event, but in none of these cases would it change global emissions. Where the R&D could pay off is if it developed over the longer term the kind of technologies that we need much further out in the future to get the world completely to a zero carbon economy. And we have to remember that's the goal. It's not a little bit of change now. It's a wholesale change in the entire world's energy system that you commit yourself to when you say we're going to go for preventing global warming.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lofgren, I think she just stepped out. Somebody tell her she's up next.
You're generous.
Yeah, every time she waited a long time. You want to make them right now?
No. When we're closing.
She's asking if we have closing remarks, and we don't usually, but if I've been waiting 30 years to be chairman so I could make closing remarks. And I don't have any closing remarks, but because y'all have been so generous with your time. And let me tell you, don't be discouraged by the empty chairs here, because this is all taken down. Gentleman right over there is taking everything down, and your total testimony will be in the record for all the other members to read, and they will be read. So you're not wasting your time on empty chairs. This is a lady that's worth waiting for. She's been a
You are
member
so
of this
nice. I was
Congress
on
for
the
a long,
phone.
long time, and we recognize you now for if you're ready to go.
I am ready to go, and I apologize. I was on the phone. This has been quite a busy morning. I was unable to be here during the delivery of the testimony because of the ranking member of a subcommittee was meeting at the same time, but I did have an opportunity to read the written testimony. And, as I'm listening to some of the questions here, Dr. Emanuel, it seems like some people are confused about the difference between climate and weather. And I'm wondering if you could give us a short summary of what the difference is.
Well, my favorite answer that I've heard to this question that you raise is one that was given by my late colleague Ed Lorenz, the father of chaos theory, who says climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. It's a murky line. One of the things that one tries to do is to look in climate records at long-term fluctuations, and depending upon what's causing the climate change, you have to average over a lot of weather fluctuations. A good example is the weather in Washington today. A few weeks ago, it was very warm, right? The trees were blooming. The temperature is clearly lower today than it was a few weeks ago. But nobody in this room would say, okay, because of that, we're not going to have summer here in Washington. They don't make that mistake. They understand that we're looking at a short-term fluctuation. The temperature of the planet was very hot in 1998 because we were experiencing a very large El Nino that year. And people say, well, it's gotten cooler since then. It's true. It means nothing, on the other hand, about the longer-term changes. What we are relatively sure of is to see what's happening with carbon dioxide, its influence. We need about at least 30 years of time series. And looking at what's happened over the last 5 or 10 years is virtually meaningless.
One of the things that in terms of my reading, and I read as a layperson, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but if you take a look at some of the historical records, it seems that the influence, temperature influence in global climate change does relate to sunlight and variability of the sun, but right now we've got a decrease and yet an increase, an up ramp. And I remember about a decade and a half ago, I went to Stanford, and the analysis that they were doing, they said, just look at the planet chemistry. Don't worry right now about measuring the temperatures. Look at the planet chemistry. And everybody, I think, agrees that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has spiked. And one of the concerns I have is how conservative scientists are by nature. You don't want to predict something that you can't prove. And yet, if these things are occurring, I worry about methane. When you take a look at the melting of permafrost, I mean, if we were to stop all emissions today, we're still going to have a very large spike in carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases. Let me ask you about whether the scientific community is in a posture where, I mean, if you can't prove that the ice on Greenland will melt. I mean, no one knows that. And yet, were that to happen, that would be a rather catastrophic event. Can you explain to me where the scientific community is relative to risk analysis when you can't prove an unknown such as that?
You've put your finger on what makes the whole enterprise so difficult. So one thing we do know beyond much doubt is that current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have not been experienced for at least 1 million years on our planet. We also know that the Greenland ice disappeared naturally in one of the previous interglacial periods over the last 800,000 years. So we know it can happen. You had mentioned, and I think it's true, that science tends to be conservative. I personally think that, people say the IPCC will turn out to be wrong, yes, but with equal probability it will turn out that they have underestimated the effect rather than overestimated. So in the last IPCC report, scientists who were the authors of that report concluded that they understood the Greenland ice problem so poorly that they weren't even able to venture. And they said, well, we're going to project an increase in sea level just based upon what we know reasonably well, which is the thermal expansion of seawater. And they said, we're not going to consider the ice. But if you want to consider the full range of possible outcomes, given that Greenland ice has largely disappeared in the past, one has to regard that, as John Holdren correctly did, as a possibility. You're talking about 7 meters of sea level rise. I think it's these issues that keep us all awake at night.
Well, it certainly does me, and I know my time is up, but I just like to say I come from Silicon Valley, and you know, the hottest part of our economy right now is green technology. I mean, it's employing thousands of people. It's the fast expanding part of technology, venture-backed. And so when I hear, gosh, you know, this is an economic problem, wow, where I come from, it's an economic opportunity. So, and I just think it's important that someone point that out. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to come back and still ask my questions, and I yield back.
Thank you. You're always worth waiting for. And Mr. Rohrbacher, the gentleman from California, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr.
You've
Chairman.
been patient, too.
Well, this is a very significant issue and deserves the type of honest debate that we've seen some of that here today, but we've also seen examples of some of the type of debate that we've had in the past on this issue. Let me note that Dr. Emanuel's statement earlier about the disinformation and some of the things that have been going on in terms of posturing and which have not been conducive to a good scientific discussion. There's some validity to what you had to say there, Dr. Emanuel, but let me just note, I have sat through 2 decades of having those people who disagree with your position, seeing them belittled, seeing their arguments dismissed without having to address the actual scientific judgments that's based. We've all heard case closed. How many of us have not heard the phrase case closed, which is nothing more than an attempt to shut off debate and honest discussion? Over and over again, we've seen these tactics. During the Clinton administration, we saw this even reach to the extent where people who I know were complaining that research grants were not available to people in the scientific community unless they had a predisposition towards proving man-made global warming. Mr. Chairman, what we have needed in this issue is an honest debate and an honest discussion. I think today was a first good step. Let me note that even with this first good step, my colleagues on the left have been unable to prevent themselves from trying to call into question the integrity of the people who disagreed with them. One of my colleagues from North Carolina just mentioned that basically talking about unethical lawyers or whatever, but could not prevent himself from suggesting that campaign donations have something to do with people's honest disagreement with his position. Well, people can honestly disagree with this. And what is the central issue? The central issue is whether or not mankind is causing a change in the climate, especially with mankind's use of what's called fossil fuels, and whether or not man-made CO2 is actually having a major impact on the climate of this planet. And it's not whether it has some impact. Everything has some impact. It's whether or not it has a major impact. And I'd just like to ask our scientists here, Dr. Armstrong, do you believe that the sun and natural causes may have more to do with the climate cycles that the Earth is going through, including the current one, than mankind's use of fossil fuel?
I work with Willie Soon, who does a lot of research on this particular topic, and that's what he tells me. I actually try not to learn a lot about climate change. I'm the forecasting guy.
All right. Well, I'd ask that of everyone. I'd like to make a couple more points before we ask this down. By the way, just so you'll note, again, asking people whether or not they have received any money, research money, from any corporation, I think, again, is an attempt to basically steer away from the arguments as to whether someone has a scientifically based argument and what that argument is, and trying to instead poison the well so you don't have to confront the actual science. And that's why, frankly, Dr. Emanuel, when you started belittling people as making mascots out of scientific mavericks, well, no, you can't dismiss someone as a mascot. Maybe some of these scientific mavericks have something to say worthwhile without having to be belittled by calling them mascots. And we've been sitting through this dishonest debate on this issue for 20 years. And thank God we have at least one forum that is presenting the other side today. What about you, Dr. Christy and Dr. Muller? Do you think that the sun and natural causes has at least as great an impact as humankind on climate change that has always existed?
Well, actually, the natural unforced variability, which is not really the sun or volcanoes or anything, but just the complexity of the system itself can create those variations on its own.
Dr. Muller?
The amount of global warming we've had so far, 1 degree Celsius, is hardly enough for anybody to even notice other than scientists who are bringing together large numbers of instruments and measurements. I would say that claims that global warming has harmed the Earth so far are not scientific. What worries me, however, is not that we have had global warming which has impacted us. I worry that the excess reported by the IPCC, this fact that the solar activity has turned down a little bit, but the warming has gone up, is simply a risk. A risk for the future. We have not had significant global warming enough to have many of the effects that are attributed to it. But that doesn't mean that the carbon dioxide is going up in a way that has been unprecedented during human existence. Mm-hmm. And that concerns me, and I think it means we need to take a measured look at it and have a measured response.
Well, we have had and by the way, Dr. Emanuel, you're just excusing the manipulation of information, calling it poor judgment rather than unethical activity on the part of the scientists is shocking.
Absolutely correct.
Is shocking.
And many panels who are in a much better position to know than you have concluded the same thing.
It's my time. Let me just note, and I'm going to give you a chance to answer that. But I do want to. I'm running out of time right now because I wanted to get to a science thing, but an actual science question.
We'll give the witness time to answer if he chooses to.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Christy. There was a period, this is when we call this medieval warming period. Is there any suggestion that that was caused by an increased level of carbon, CO2, especially by human beings? And if not, if the use of CO2 was actually less than it is now, how can we then, and it was warmer then, how can we say that scientifically that today's cycle, that seems to be a little bit warming anyway, was caused by CO2?
I think you're thinking like a lawyer. It's hard to convict carbon dioxide of warming back then when it wasn't there.
Right.
So the crime happened without the presence of carbon dioxide. If you think of it as a crime, I think the world might like warmer, actually.
And I will be happy to let Dr. Emanuel answer my challenge to his dismissal of the significance of the alteration of information by scientists in presenting their case to the American public and the world.
Thank you for the opportunity to make some clarifications. Let me first state that if you read my testimony, I was very careful to say that mavericks are a very, very important part of the scientific enterprise. I, in other issues, am a maverick. and I know many of them. They appreciate
But you're
them.
not a
They're good.
mascot.
I was criticizing extra scientific organizations who made mascots out of Mavericks, and that's a very different matter, and I just simply want to be clear about that. Now, on the issue of this one proxy record, let's talk about what it is. It was a tree ring proxy record, and there is a well-known problem that had been published for several years before this report came out that noted that several of the tree ring proxies diverged from the instrumental record in modern times. There is clearly a problem. It's discussed all over the literature. It's called the divergence problem. And the graph in question, the authors chose, and this was not part of a peer-reviewed report, by the way. It was supposed to be kind of a popular report. They chose to take away that part of one proxy record that was demonstrably false. I think what they should have done, and what we all feel they should have done, is taken that whole proxy away because it was provably wrong, all right? There's no question that that was scientifically wrong. What we concluded that there was not, on the other hand, an intent to deceive anyone. If it was very poorly conceived because anybody who wanted to could immediately find, and did find, the original records. You could throw all of that away. You could take away all the science done by anybody in that group that you thought was questionable, and it wouldn't change anything about the conclusions because the weight of the rest of the evidence is so large.
And we have an answer from any of the others of you that want to answer, Dr.
I would just say,
Emanuel.
I think that minimizes what actually happened in that situation. It was the icon of the TAR, the third assessment report, and what the tree ring record did in showing that it did not agree with temperatures indicated that the icon itself, which was based primarily on tree rings prior to the 16th century, was therefore not very good at explaining what the temperature was. So both were improperly shown as one was cut off and one was shown as a correct representation of temperature when it really wasn't. Had no skill in that thing.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I was trained in science by Louis Alvarez, who not only won the Nobel Prize and lots of other discoveries, but is sort of a hero. He was over Hiroshima measuring the size of the blast when it happened. Louis Alvarez taught me the fundamental scientific rule, which is you've got to show everybody your dirty laundry. I remember vividly the first time I was at a seminar in his home when Lina Galtieri, a great physicist, got up there, and I heard she had made a discovery. And she spent the first 35 minutes of her 45-minute talk showing all of the evidence against what she was going to claim. In the end, when she showed her evidence, it was compelling because it was stronger than everything else. My problem with the way the hockey stick was derived was that there was none of this. Louis Alvarez taught me that if you hide something, if you don't show something because you're afraid people will draw the wrong conclusions, the person you're most likely to fool is yourself.
Thank you.
May I respond to, Mr. Chairman? I think a couple of things here. First of all, ClimateGate was about a large number of things. The hockey stick has gotten all the publicity as rightly it should because the hockey stick was the fundamental way, was the fundamental piece of evidence on which climate change was presented to the public in the IPCC report. So ClimateGate is about that. That is fundamental, but ClimateGate is about a bunch of other things as well. It is a large pattern of activity. And I think we've heard discussion today about the various review panels that were undertaken mostly in England. And there are a few things that you need to understand about those review panels. First of all, the fact that the English felt that it was necessary to investigate what had happened is something that we wish EPA had done as well. They felt that there was enough here to take a look and to have some kind of process. And that's all that we have asked EPA to do here is just take a look at this, let the public comment. EPA looked at it and said, nothing here, we're not even going to let the public comment. That's a process flow. That's number one. Number two, none of these review panels, including the Oxborough panel, operated according to any kind of procedures that would even remotely approach the standards that we would use here in the United States. We've heard about interviews that weren't made public, failure to hear dissenting points of view. That's all important also. And then the third thing I would have to say is that although this doesn't get publicized very much, all of those review panels, in fact, were very critical of a lot of the procedures that were used by the scientists that they were reviewing, including the review panel that Dr. Emanuel served on, that said in specific that they were actually very surprised that the statisticians in question, or the climatologists in question that were producing material like the hockey stick, which is fundamentally a statistical analysis, did not think it necessary to consult with disinterested professional statisticians. There was concern expressed across all of these review panels about failure to respond to freedom of information requests, operating in a culture of secrecy, not providing information to scientists who didn't share their views. That's ultimately what ClimateGate is all about, and that's why it's created so many questions.
Does that do it, Mr. Montgomery?
Just one thought, which is that even if all of the climate science was accepted as good science, we still need to worry about the bad economics and bad policy analysis that have been used to leap to conclusions about what should be done from that basis.
Okay, Mrs. Woolsey wants to make a closing remark. Recognize you for
a minute.
For a couple of 3 minutes. Whatever time you take, as long as you don't take over 5 minutes.
I won't. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to respond to Mr. Rohrbacher about today's panel representing the other side, because I don't think that's the conversation we've had today, because every single person said that global warming is happening. Every single person said that human activity is a factor and that science must be continued. I think there's an agreement in that. And I think the challenge is exactly how we're going to have science that is understandable and acceptable, so without giving up real science. So now, it's clear, Mr. Chairman, this debate has focused a lot on the IPCC. But, even if you reject the report, I don't, but I need to point out that there are many other reputable sources of scientific information, like the United States National Academy of Sciences, and we accept their reports. In addition, every significant, relevant scientific society has put out statements that are in agreement with the mainstream view of climate science. And obviously, all of those groups cannot be wrong. So as I said when I came in, after hearing the esteemed Secretary of Energy, Secretary Stephen Chu, this morning at 9 o'clock, and then came in here, I really could be living in a parallel universe. And I thank you for keeping me sane through it.
Lady's time has finally expired.
Could I make a comment on that? I think I was misrepresented by her.
I'll recognize you for a minute, 2 minutes if you need it.
She said every single person was recognizing that global warming was happening. I did not say that. I said it had happened, and that we have no idea whether the temperature is going to go up or go down. Secondly, the whole notion of voting by scientists is not a scientific method. In fact, it's an anti-scientific method. It's the way that scientists prevent change.
Okay. Let me just say that this is a group that I had heard had some questions about the science. You've expressed that somewhere. You wouldn't be here. We've asked you to come. Dr. Montgomery, your testimony has been very valuable, because in a mile of here, there's probably 1,000 places of business. Every one of them have a door. People walk through. They go in there and they pick out something. And what's the next thing they have to do? They have to pay for it. They got to go buy a cash register. And I read to some witnesses about 5 or 6 weeks ago, had they ever been to Walmart's, and they said yes. Did you buy anything? Yes. And what did you next do? And they didn't any of them know. They just didn't say anything. Did you see anything unusual and everything? Did you see a thing called a cash register, and I had a dictionary with me, and I called out to these Phi Beta Kappa people what a cash register was. I read them 2 or 3 paragraphs of it. Still didn't agree. You know, we've spent $30 billion, and we're in debt $14 trillion right now on our children. And we've only got pamphlets to show for this since it came out of the 90s. And we needed this hearing today, and we're going to have other hearings that will give those other folks a chance to justify their findings and answer the questions just like you all have. We're going to put them under oath. I hope they'll come. I hope they're as kind as you all have been giving us your time. And I certainly want to thank you for that. I'll just close with this. I was a paper boy in the 30s, and I served Bonnie and Clyde one time from a drugstore there. Gave them curb service. They won 2 Coca-Colas, a carton of Old Golds, and all of the newspapers we had. And anyway, I called the Greenville police. It's just one road from Los Angeles to Miami. Then that's Route 66. Came right through my town. Told them that they were headed in that direction. They said, "Well, dogs been killing some sheep out on the north part of town. We're going out there and shoot them dogs." So you can always do the wrong thing with good information. But we also had, let me finish. I haven't used up all my time. We also had a fellow named Dr. Something that came to Dallas with something that we'd never heard of before. He was a weather predictor. And he had a sling psychometer. My God, I had no idea what it was, but he would use that sling psychometer at 6 o'clock every morning on WRR and tell them what the weather was. Now, we used the word maverick up there. There was a maverick projector up at Paris, Texas. He'd listen to him, and he'd predict just the opposite. He didn't have a sling psychometer or anything, and he was right 80% of the time. I guess that's the way it goes. Thank you very much for your time. Thank all of you, and I thank you for your valuable testimony and answering the questions. The members of this committee may have additional questions for any one of you, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. The witnesses are excused, and this hearing is adjourned.